From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio on the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're a longtime fan reliving these monumental events or a newcomer eager to understand wrestling's rich history, you're in the right place. This episode is packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises along the way. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. July 26, 1999 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Governor Jesse Ventura to referee Summerslam main event. Nevada State Athletic Commission to evaluate UFC, tons more. By Dave Meltzer. With the official announcement of Jesse Ventura's participation in SummerSlam as the referee for the main event came the expected debate over his involvement. Ventura was announced by Vince McMahon in the referee's role, which McMahon, in response to later questions, claimed would be in a one-on-one match. There had been rumors of a 3- or 4-way match to create more intrigue and so more wrestlers would get the rub for the title, with the winner of the Steve Austin vs. Undertaker match on July 25 in Buffalo for the fully loaded pay-per-view facing the winner of the Rock vs. Hunter Hearst Helmsley match on August 22 at the Target Center in Minneapolis. The general feeling for months has been SummerSlam was going to be Austin vs. Helmsley, and at least for a long period of time that was also the internal plan. Plans of course change these days on a moment's notice, so nothing is etched in stone. The press conference held on July 14 in Minneapolis with several thousand wrestling fans plus local and national media present included Ventura, Vince and Shane McMahon, X-Pac, Rock, Helmsley, Chyna, who was photographed with Ventura, who appeared both in a suit and later wearing a feathered boa reminiscent of his days in wrestling, Austin, Undertaker, Paul Bearer, Jim Ross and others. Ventura is expected to not only do SummerSlam, but also help promote the show. Not all the appearance terms are worked out, but it is expected Ventura would appear on Raw, both in taped interviews and also do at least one, perhaps two live appearances and angles on Raw in the final weeks. Without any question, involving the Minnesota governor in a major wrestling show was a huge coup for Titan Sports. Not only will the media publicity lead to an increase in buys for the show itself, but it'll also do wonders for the visibility of the product mainstream with the news features after the event and the rub it will give to the wrestlers involved in angles and photo ops with him. There is no question Steve Austin's mainstream name value and ultimately, his pro wrestling drawing power and the entire profile of the WWF, took a major jump due to Mike Tyson's involvement, and this is another opportunity for Titan to get stars exposed to a larger audience. And wrestling fans will both have fun and be entertained by it. The timing, coming off so much bad news for Titan in the wake of the death of Owen Hart, the Rena Mero lawsuit and the incident where the 3-year-old boy died, which led to many additional news stories tying all three together with the negative debate about the product itself, can't be overemphasized. Still, most of the debate about Ventura's involvement has been very shallow. Nobody is arguing whether usage of Ventura is a good deal for the WWF. It is without question. But is it good for Ventura? That's a tougher question. If Ventura's goal was to be a one-term governor and use the office to increase his celebrity profile and make as much money for himself, then this is a tremendous coup for him. If his goal is to aspire to a larger office, it's a harder one to read. Certainly it puts his term in the eyes of some people as a clown show, but my feeling, if the electorate in Minnesota largely felt that involvement with pro wrestling was somehow a negative from an image standpoint for their governor, they would have never elected him. After what the public has gone through with politicians over the past years, the fact Ventura would perform in a WWF show can't be taken seriously as a major negative compared to real scandals. Minnesotans elected someone who didn't care about the traditional role politicians would place themselves in, and that's what they got. They also thought, at least if they believed his campaign and voted for him because they were fed up with politics as usual and just didn't vote for him because it happened to be the cool thing to do on that day, that they elected someone who spoke his mind and couldn't be bought or swayed by special interests. A close examination of this issue proved that not to be the case. They got a more colorful, charismatic version of a typical double-talking politician. While some in the media can't come to terms with this, inherently, the idea of a former wrestler participating in pro wrestling shouldn't be a surprise. Whoever leaves pro wrestling voluntarily and never looks back? Especially with the kind of revenue a major wrestling pay-per-view event generates these days, between all forms of revenue, SummerSlam will generate in excess of $25 million overall. The WWF itself will take in well over $13 million on the event and subsequent income directly tied to the event. And with a high profile the television shows have become as the leading draws on cable. And there is nothing inherently wrong with the entertainment spectacle as pro wrestling any more than any other form of entertainment. Politicians, even presidents, have done cameos on television before. If a politician was going to have a small role in a movie, or do an off-Broadway play, it would garner some attention, but I doubt it would garner much debate over whether it was beneath the dignity of the office. It would certainly be hypocritical of anyone within pro wrestling to be critical of Ventura for doing pro wrestling on the surface, with no extenuating circumstances. Nobody ever knocked Hiroshi Hashi, who is currently in the Japanese Diet Senate, and still works major shows for All Japan, although mainly between sessions. Nobody knocked Antonio Inoki, who, while a senator, was a headline wrestler on major shows for New Japan. In fact, when Inoki was in office and became riddled with his own scandal, the question wasn't Inoki demeaning the office to participate in pro wrestling, but pro wrestling demeaning the sport by continuing to use Inoki as a drawing card while he was such a controversial political figure. That was enough of an issue that in 1994, most notably for the famous Inoki vs. Great Muta match at the Fukuoka Dome, TV Asahi refused to broadcast the match that without question would be drawn huge ratings because they had at the time had a ban of Inoki appearing on the network. But there are always extenuating circumstances and questions. There is the question of the current product mix of the WWF. As mentioned before, nobody would probably say a word nationally. There probably would be some debate within the state about Ventura having a small movie role that required a few days of filming. But if it was a raunchy R movie, and I'm not saying that's what WWF should be categorized as, but just trying to make an argument, it'd be heavily criticized from all sides for participation. WWF television at times can be raunchy, and no matter what it claims its audience aims are, its demographics and its sponsors do not say adult entertainment. Ventura's participation, not because he's Ventura the person but because he's the Minnesota governor, is an endorsement of that product. Pro wrestling does lead to more aggressive behavior in some children, which can result in more fights on the playground, but so can pro football, admittedly to a lesser degree. Pro wrestling can also lead to young children telling girls to suck it or show their puppies, something pro football at this point in time doesn't lead to. But Jerry Springer might if, and this is a big if, Springer had similar demos, which it doesn't. There are other questions about the current product, which are addressed here weekly, and there is no need to belabor those points. Did Ventura truly consider any of those? Or did he just look at the zeros in the check? If he didn't consider those points, he'd be no different most likely from many other politicians, except they'd look at how the public would react, and Ventura probably figured the people who voted for him would think it's cool anyway. How many people in the world, really, with a huge check in front of them for really very little work, would turn it down? Anyone who would expect Jesse Ventura to turn it down is naive at best. It's easy from the outside without those zeros in front of your face thinking how it can provide for your family to say he shouldn't do it. Now, whether the governor of Minnesota should have turned it down is a different question, except they are one and the same. Maybe he did consider those points and his own value structure felt they weren't significant points. The fact is, agree or disagree, Ventura has not been inconsistent on this issue. When asked about the current product mix of pro wrestling when it started being a big media issue months ago, he has always said that if parents don't like their kids watching it, they should turn off the television set. That's called parenting. He did point out in his wrestling days that wrestling wasn't wholesome family entertainment, noting in particular the xenophobic values pro wrestling promoted with the Japanese and Iranian stereotypical heel characters of the early 80s, and it isn't like there weren't a lot of kids in Minnesota who grew up watching Ventura on television participating in that product who later voted for him in the last election. He's never publicly criticized the product mix of today's wrestling, but has been very critical, particularly in his book and more so in recent weeks while promoting his book, of the machinations of pro wrestling, such as the need for a union, the control of the promoters, etc. But if he didn't, and this is strictly a money deal, he'd still not be that much different than many other politicians, but those politicians would also be up for heavy criticism for that. Whether being no different from what others have done and would do is a fair defense for someone who ran on the platform that the people wouldn't be getting that kind of politician is something Minnesotans have to decide. The fact they elected him in the first place tells me the issue of him doing wrestling per se isn't much of an issue. After what happened this past year to our president, that the deeper his self-created mess got right up to and including impeachment itself, the higher his popularity rating grew. The public is numb to criticism of politicians to the point the greater the criticism, regardless of the issue. After a period of time the public gets tired of it and, in wrestling vernacular, it babyfaces the person. This becoming an issue probably won't affect him greatly nationally, even if many politicians this week were calling it political suicide. But there are hard questions that need to be answered, but again, these are far too technical in application for the average person on the street to care. Ventura and the WWF at the press conference presented the illusion that he would be getting a $100,000 appearance fee, which would be split equally as a grant to Roosevelt High, Ventura's alma mater, and another charity. While they admitted he'd make other income from royalties and the usage of his name and likeness, it was presented to the public and media as if it's a charity appearance, and much of the national media actually bought it as such. Luckily, the question of what he was really going to earn may have almost overwhelmed his appearance itself. Ventura's market value, given what celebrities have been paid for appearances in wrestling over the past 2 years, would figure to be in the range of $2 million for the show, which is not to say he's getting quite that much. He'll mean far more than Jay Leno, $1 million. He should mean more than Dennis Rodman the first time out in 1997, $750,000 base, but with his cut of the pay-per-view ended up with more than $1 million. He may not mean more than Rodman and Malone combined when they worked against each other, a $3.2 million combined payoff, or Mike Tyson, more than $3.5 million. In hindsight, Leno proved not to be worth at the box office a seven-figure sum because the show didn't draw well. Rodman and Malone's match was a huge draw, but WCW may have still overpaid them based on market value. I'd say it's a safe assumption that SummerSlam this year will do more buys than any of the aforementioned shows with celebrities, with the possible exception of the Tyson WrestleMania, and quite frankly, I think it'll be in the range if not beat that one as well, not because Ventura will necessarily mean more than Tyson, but because WWF is a hotter company now. I can't imagine Ventura selling himself too short in negotiations unless he needed a quick buck, and all indications were they came to him and not the other way around. Barry Bloom, his agent, is probably more familiar with market value of wrestlers and celebrities in this industry than any agent, and perhaps just about any person, could be at this time. Being that McMahon is benefiting from this when it comes to not only higher profile of his own company but the more important at this time image enhancement and changing of the media wrestling story from something bad to something fun, his value is far more than simply whatever additional revenue he brings to the event and the rub his name gives the main event wrestlers he's associated with. It isn't as if the two are long-standing friends and Ventura feels the need to help an old friend out during a period he's in a jam, even if some could argue that Ventura does owe some debt as far as being made a celebrity to McMahon's decision to make him a color commentator when his days as a headline wrestler were over. Quite frankly, whatever some would think Ventura should owe McMahon for that break should have been greatly tempered by McMahon threatening to fire Ventura over making a movie deal, and then firing him at the peak of his career as an announcer over a video game deal, not to mention the somewhat nasty lawsuit. If Ventura is making in excess of $1 million, which he should be, trying to position the figure in the $100,000 range is terribly misleading. Both WWF and Ventura trying to position this as more of a charity appearance than what it really is close to, if not a complete fraud. This is a hard fact of reality. 2 years ago, the former wrestling announcer Jesse Ventura, had he wanted to referee at SummerSlam, there is no luck because of past bitterness that McMahon would have even taken him. It isn't as if either major wrestling organization did one thing to subtly or not so subtly promote or help Ventura when he was running in what turned out to be a very close election where he was a distinct underdog even going into the last day. But if McMahon would have taken him 2 years ago for the same gig, one would guess as a one-time fee, he'd probably get in the range of $40,000 to $50,000, maybe, because of the lawsuit, a small piece of eventual videotape royalties. There would be zero mainstream press interest in it. It would mean almost nothing when it comes to buy rate. But today, as Minnesota Governor Jesse Ventura, a wrestling icon that he never was when he actually was in wrestling, he's worth and should get well into the seven figures. The voters of Minnesota, by electing him, created his worth. For that reason, his trying to position the deal he cut as nobody's business and the extent he's gone to hide the deal, WWF personnel are forbidden to talk about it at Ventura's request, would make me very uneasy when a major political figure goes to such a great extent to hide things, citing it as only his personal business. Ventura's actions have to be compared with that of another governor, John Kitzhaber of Oregon, whose influence just a few weeks ago killed a bill to amend state law regarding drug testing of wrestlers, even though doing so would bring both a major entertainment form and added revenue to his state, because of the belief of the message it would send by amending a law because the people it governs avoid doing business in the state because presumably they know their performers may not be able to abide by it. The reaction of both WWF and WCW to Oregon law bring up another point regarding today's wrestling, the drug issue, that can be questioned when it comes to Ventura's involvement in the current product. Again, it's his value structure when it comes to those issues, but as governor, those value structures are all open to public and media criticism. There is a possible question of conflict of interest. Ventura, while in office as governor, is taking money from a corporation that does a lot of business in the state. It's a business that is regulated in different forms and fashions in different states, from no regulation at all to regulation to the extent, in the form of legitimate drug testing, that the company refuses to do business in one state. Regulation of wrestling has become a political issue in several states over the past decade. But in all this, there was one thing that bothered me the most. As coincidence would have it, Ventura's book was released at roughly the same time Hart died. He had a promotional tour for the book lined up taking place literally days after the death, which landed him on major radio and television stations nationally right through Jay Leno and Larry King. The subject of Hart's death and pro wrestling, due to the timing of his tour, was asked everywhere. On Larry King, the night after Hart died, Ventura was on with Eric Bischoff, and was so critical of the stunt and what pro wrestling had become that Bischoff felt forced into a rare position of defending McMahon because Ventura was so strongly attacking the industry in general. Everywhere he went, the story was the same. Hart wasn't a trained stuntman. They don't take enough precautions when doing these things. Pro wrestlers aren't independent contractors like they are listed, and they need a union. Hart felt that he had to do it because there was no union, and he knew that while he could say no if it did, it would affect his position and his income. It's not hypocritical for Ventura to not believe everything is perfect within wrestling and still perform in the industry. I don't know one WWF or WCW performer who doesn't question or isn't uneasy about some aspects of the job, the product, and the direction of the company. Nobody ever could totally agree with their boss on every decision in this or any other business without being a mindless zombie. But when asked by reporters at the press conference about these issues, a new Ventura emerged. Nobody has to be a wrestler if they don't like the terms, he was quoted as saying, and in respect to Hart's situation itself, he said, "If you don't like what the promoter asks you, you don't have to be a wrestler." When asked about all his criticism of the wrestling industry and if he'd now worked to change things for the betterment of the employees, his response was one person can't change everything. When asked if he'd join with Steve Austin or other wrestlers to try and get the wrestlers unionized, he flatly said no, which brought a nice positive reaction from McMahon sitting next to him. As governor of Minnesota, Ventura, one could argue, should have more important things on his plate than trying to make things better in one private sector entertainment industry, maybe even if he's having a minor involvement in it. He directly answered the questions. But in many interviews, including on his recent book tour and in that book, he complained about these same issues as if they were very serious before anyone was throwing money in his direction. If they weren't important, he should have said that wrestling isn't important in the big world he's governing in. During his campaign, he often said there was too much made of pro wrestling because he'd held many jobs since leaving wrestling. But without pro wrestling, there would be no Jesse Ventura, and he wouldn't have become the cool celebrity that the early 20s voters used to watch as kids on television that become an anti-establishment protest candidate. His comments on Hart's death just a few weeks ago and his comments on the circumstances of Hart's death this past week were a total 180. Ventura isn't the first politician to get a fat check from an industry and suddenly change his views, but that makes him no different and no better than any of the others who did the same thing. In the week after Hart's death and Ventura's media appearances, I thought he'd make a great person to chair a commission to help make changes for the better in an industry that clearly has problems that don't seem to be being addressed, and if you think things out can't be addressed without some type of an agreement among the leading companies to give power to an independent board overseeing the business. For obvious reasons, I didn't think it was possible, but rather than be like so many who complained about wrestling after the death with no suggestions to make things better, or wrestling media types who continually run from issues of this type, at least it was an attempt, albeit a long shot, at a positive step. Ventura's name was important in that story not only because of how vocal he'd been in the previous week, not that Ventura has such great convictions and not that I'd even vote for him if he was running in an election, but because of the belief he'd become such a powerful figure that he'd have no reason to kowtow his viewpoints to protect the big players in the industry against the ramifications of otherwise positive changes. Just the week before this all came down, the Pro Wrestling Torch ran a long story about Ventura relating to his book, and despite its editor often being criticized in the local media by Ventura, Wade Keller noted at heart he is a fearless leader, probably immune to corruption, who gets a thrill out of bucking the system. And to be fair, Ventura's reaction to The Observer went from being one of the first people in the business to praise it publicly and admit to reading it in the mid-80s while still working for the WWF at a time when I was considered public enemy number one by that company. A stance which was at least publicly a 180-degree difference from virtually everyone in the profession in those days, and rather gutsy at least at that point in time, to knocking it heavily when his own level of work as an announcer declined so greatly in WCW, which hardly went unnoticed and eventually would cost him his job there, and then reacting by devoting several of his hotlines to his uncovering things about myself, his biggest revelation being that the Observer annual poll results were all made up, and that in particular he knew that nobody really ever voted for Jim Ross, who he personally hated, for Best Announcer all those years, to publicly calling me a parasite shortly after winning the election, to going on an unexplained tirade about me in front of reporters after the press conference this past week because I had said he was a bad worker in the ring. The leading TV political reporter in the Twin Cities, Pat Kessler, reported after the entertaining press conference that whatever you think of Ventura, at least he's consistent in his views. Unfortunately, myself, nor any other reporter sometimes critical of him and believing him still to have a lot of guts, whether you agree or not with him or even respect him, believe he at least speaks and acts on his own convictions. Got a reality check. This past week Jesse Ventura was revealed as just another politician whose viewpoints are on sale to the highest bidder. It appears that Rena Maro's lawsuit against Titan Sports is on the verge of a settlement. The $140 million lawsuit, which garnered much publicity with the sensationalistic sexual harassment charges, was at its best and worst a high-stakes poker game in an attempt for Maro to get the rights to the name Sable and to keep her reported $850,000 deal with Playboy that she negotiated rather than having it been negotiated by Titan Sports, as her contract with the company owning her likeness specified it would have to be. On July 12 in court in Hartford, Connecticut, it was ruled that Titan Sports owned the rights to the name Sable. There was no legal precedent, even if Maro was able to prove her charges, where she would get the name. So it appeared her strategy was hoping Titan would settle on the name out of court rather than incur the bad publicity her charges would bring. When Titan moved to have the issue of the name settled immediately, long before a jury trial, and won that aspect, the key element, as opposed to the elements of the suit largely meant for publicity purposes, were already settled. At that point, negotiations began and continued throughout the week to work out a settlement between the two sides. Details of these negotiations are said to be highly confidential because the settlement was not completed, but it was expected a settlement to be completed in short order and the lawsuit to disappear. The major issues needing to be finalized appear not to be money directly as far as a money settlement, which may not even be an issue at this point, but more the financial details and split of the Playboy deal. The magazine already promos next month's magazine billing her as Sable, and the magazine, which comes out in a few weeks, may have gone to press already with her billed as Rena Maro, the artist formerly known as Sable, future merchandise revenue, terms of her release and the release of Mark Maro, and attempts for both sides to come out of this while saving as much face publicly, and there is belief that when all is settled that a confidentiality clause will be placed over the settlement, and that both sides would agree not to denigrate the other side publicly. ECW's Heat Wave, largely a show designed to get through while waiting for TNN to shoot the big angles, was an often raunchy show saved by a strong main event. The show drew approximately 3,700, paying $124,000 to Hara Arena in Dayton, Ohio, the show coming slightly short of the paid attendance, although with higher ticket prices drew a better gate than last year's pay-per-view in the same building, was blamed on a screw-up in the placement of the local television ads, none of which aired until the very end. If anyone felt ECW was going to play it safe with its TNN deal, heavily pushed throughout the show in place, was in for quite an awakening. Coming on the heels of week-in-ring PPVs from both WWF and WCW, ECW had the chance to shine, and there was no shortage of effort on display, and it had the crazy stunts from the power bombs through flaming tables, balcony dives and bloodbaths in what was either the best spectacle or the low point of the show depending upon your point of view. The show opened solidly and picked up with a good, but nothing out of the ordinary match with Super Crazy versus Little Guido. Then came the Dudleys. After 12 minutes of mic work, largely swearing at and baiting the crowd, which started out as bad and after never ending, got incredibly boring, came the garbage match. It was the spectacle the live crowd came to see, with all the blood, using in particular, cheese graters to the forehead with both Bubba Ray Dudley and Balls Mahoney then licking the blood from their opponent after slicing and dicing them with the graters. It was one of those matches where there was little heat in between the big spots and the wrestling was at the level of a really bad hardcore match on Nitro, but the crowd knew what it wanted and was chanting flaming tables, leading up to the double flaming table spot. This match and pre-match turned out to be controversial, as there were folks in the cable industry, in particular at Viewers' Choice and also at TNN, who were upset about the pre-match mic work by Bubba, both the level of the swearing and inciting the crowd, feeling he was inciting a riot, and the match, in particular the close-ups of the blood and the flaming tables, although the tables were in the pre-match script. This, according to several sources, resulted in the next match of ECW pulling back to a wide-angle shot that may as well have been shot by a helicopter for all you could see, a la WCW when barbed wire was used. Heyman's response to the controversy backstage was a post-show curtain call where the audience was very appreciative of the event, trying to portray it as an audience that understands what the show is and is not prone to riot, which is the case in the vast majority of cases, and the only problem is the rare exception. That apparently at least placated the execs to a degree. After the surprise title change came the New Jack run-in. But between that and an angle involving Tommy Dreamer, doing a retirement tease, the same angle ECW has already done in recent months with Shane Douglas, which was a great angle, and with Chris Condito, which was a terrible angle. The show was slow in the middle with 1 hour of talking and a long match only good for the stunt man spots. Taz vs Tajiri wasn't bad, but it was a disappointment for a world title match on pay-per-view, partially because nobody in the building thought Tajiri had a chance to win. Even the late angle leading to this match where Tajiri laid out Taz in Queens, which didn't air until the weekend of the show, didn't register that strong because when Tajiri did the same spots and went for a pin, there wasn't even a reaction for Taz kicking out. The show was largely in the middle at this point with the main event telling the story. Since it involved ECW's best workers, it was a very good match ending with a three-way brawl involving Sabu, Jerry Lynn, and Rob Van Dam, theoretically setting those three up for the main event on the next pay-per-view on September 19th in Villa Park, Chicago metro area, which without question becomes the most important show in company history. After the show, Heyman said that the three-way was a possibility for the next show, but there were other ideas he is considering, including Sabu versus Justin Credible. As mentioned, the TNN deal was heavily pushed throughout the show, including emphasizing that the first taping, for an August 27th air date, would take place now on August 14th in Toledo, where 2 hours would be taped. The August 26th show in Queens would tape the hour of TNN for September 10th, and as it stands now, it appears the September 11th show in Buffalo would tape for the September 17th TNN show. The big question seems to be whether with TNN, can ECW pass WCW as the number 2 promotion in the United States? All sorts of logical and financial reasons say no, but if WCW continues its current slide and ECW can position itself as the in thing in a short-term faddish society, it figures to be a closer race than anyone in WCW at this point may understand. Don Callis, formerly Jackal in WWF and now sometimes called Cyrus but usually not called much of anything, joined Joey Styles for the announcing. Giving Styles somebody to play off was a big improvement on a 3-hour show. Callis was good at both getting the performers and the match over as well as pushing his character. There were a lot of inside references to WWF and his failed tenure there. There was less knocking of other products and rather just pointing out the strengths of their own product. The announcers always come across better on good shows than bad shows anyway. 1. Chris Chetti and Nova, Mike Bucci, Lee Danny During, Danny Morrison, and Amish Roadkill, Mike DiPaoli, in 703. During brought out an unnamed woman who looked like the photo next to the word skank in the dictionary and asked her to marry him. The crowd chanted "She's got herpes," and if that wasn't enough to make him reconsider, "She's a crack whore" came next. She accepted. During didn't have a ring, but did give her a condom to wear on her finger. Chetti is showing some personality doing his Ricky Martin gimmick with Nova mad at him, but they didn't split up here and even won the match. Roadkill is noticeably improving from big show to big show. During has no physique, but has a world-class tan. They did some creative spots including Nova doing a spinning neckbreaker in the opposite of the normal direction, the Spin Doctor, and Nova did a combination ace crusher and DDT on both men simultaneously. Nova at one point monkey flipped Chetti into doing a double clothesline on both guys. At this point the music played and Chetti did his Ricky Martin. There was no crowd reaction to this at all. During's fiancée then ran in and began dancing with Chetti. At some point the girl slapped Chetti and he gave her his big move, the Amityville Horror fireman's carry into a Michinoku driver. Nova used a kryptonite crunch on During. Finally Chetti and Nova won with the tidal wave, Nova doing a splash off the top and Chetti doing a leg drop off the top, with both coming off the same turnbuckle onto I believe Roadkill. Rough in spots but a lot of creative moves. 2 stars. 2. Jazz, Arlene Moore, pinned Jason Knight, in a woman versus man match in 6:33. Reports were these two were having horrible house show matches, but this was decent for what it was. Jazz is a great athlete, and if there was a such thing as women's wrestling, with experience she'd have potential to be really good at it. She seemed green at things like coming off the ropes but was already better than most women in the US are working as pro wrestlers. The angle wasn't over because it was just shot at the last television, but the fans got into Jazz offense when Jason sold it, including a body slam and a Samoan drop. Jazz finally won with an X Factor on a chair. 3/4 of a star. 3. Super Crazy Francisco Pantoja Islas pinned Little Guido James Maritato in 12:31. Callis came out for color before this match. They did a cool spot early where Crazy did a springboard into the ring but got caught with a Fujiwara armbar by Guido. Crazy did a moonsault body block off the balcony at one point. Eventually huge Sal Graziano squashed Crazy on the guardrail and power slammed him on the floor. This latter move should have been used as an angle when Crazy had to leave for 6 weeks for a Japan tour, but instead it was a transition spot to set up a Boston Crab in the ring that Crazy got a rope break from. Graziano then did a fame fat asser on Crazy, but he kicked out. Guido got one near fall after another. At one point Crazy went for his 3 straight moonsault spot where he does it from the bottom, middle, then top rope, but on the third, he lost his balance and fell off the ropes. He climbed back up and gave Graziano a plancha, then came back for his moonsault off the top but missed it. Guido used a Tommy Rogers tomahawk for a near fall, but Crazy came back with an arms folded power bomb for the pin. 3 stars. 4. Balls Mahoney, John Reschner, and Spike Dudley, Matthew Hyson, Eat Bubba Ray, Mark LaMonica, and Devin Hughes. Dudley in 1541 to win the ECW tag titles. As mentioned, Bubba laid into members of the crowd with obscenity-laced mic work that never ended. It's one of those things that starts out shocking and quickly gets boring. It may work at a house show, but it makes for really boring television. Only in this case, it kept going for several minutes long after boring. By the time Joel Gertner came out to do his shtick, a good show was falling into the toilet. Mahoney came out and was literally begging the fans to sing his entrance music song, and you could see they weren't doing it. It was like watching a 350-pound Rey Mysterio Jr. go hooty-hoo. They announced this as a Falls Count Anywhere street fight. Spike, the human dart, took a big bump over the top, crashing onto the ramp. Bubba used a sick chair shot on Mahoney. Devon hit Spike with the ring bell and he was bleeding right away. Bubba used the cheese grater on Mahoney and he got out the blade and was bleeding. Bubba started licking it. Balls got it, rubbed it on Bubba's head, he bladed and Mahoney started licking it. They brawled in the crowd to set up a pretty spectacular balcony dive by Spike. That balcony must have been 13 feet high. Then came near falls by the Dudleys, including simultaneous power bombs off the ropes for near falls. Fans chanted flaming tables. Even with the big spots, if this match was on a WCW pay-per-view by this point it would be well into the negative star range. Spike and Balls did their big moves, acid drop and nutcracker suite, for near falls. Actually Sign Guy pulled ref John Finnegan out of the ring before he could make the count. Spike and Balls then did an inside cradle and schoolboy combination on both Dudleys for the pin and to win the titles. Fans popped big because nobody really expected the title switch. After the match, the Dudleys laid both guys out with 3D, then lit the tables on fire. Devon powerbombed Spike through one. Bubba went to powerbomb Mahoney through the other, but lost him and dropped him on his head near the table. Mahoney was wearing long sleeves and may have been protected since he had second-degree burns from all the previous fire spots. However, Bubba then relit the table on fire, but Mahoney stayed down and nothing happened with the table except the fire flamed out. New Jack came in with the bucket of weapons and not guilty sign and destroyed the Dudleys with a garbage can, a can lid, a vacuum cleaner and a broiler pan to the groin, among other things. Joey Styles then talked about how Jack was going to destroy Mahoney and Spike, which of course gave away the exact opposite would happen, and he raised their arms. It is what people who come to see ECW want to see, which is partially the geek show side of wrestling. 1 star. Tommy Dreamer and Francine came out. Dreamer bagged on King of the Ring and Bash at the beach. At least he bagged on shows that weren't any good. He pushed the TNN deal, but when he talked about TNN being on in Canada, the fans suddenly booed him. He responded saying, "When did we ever go to war with Canada?" And they booed him again. He thanked all the fans so they liked him again, and then he started crying to tease the retirement announcement. Unfortunately, while Dreamer started crying to set the mood, the crowd decided to chant "We want puppies." Corino came out with Rhino and Jack Victory and did some great mic work saying Dreamer was 28, has 2 herniated discs, needs back surgery and needs to retire. He said with Dreamer on the way out, he should put over the new stars and told him he should do a job for him. Dreamer said he wouldn't. Corino punched and chopped Dreamer to death, with Dreamer not even selling any of them. With his back in its condition, I don't know that he even can. Dreamer came back and threw 1 haymaker and a few chops. Dreamer moved like Bill Watts did when his hamstring was shot and he was 46 years old, making a comeback, and everyone had to bump for him because he was the boss. After Dreamer laid out Corino, Francine did the Bronco Buster and a DDT on him and they counted the pin. Yoshihiro Tajiri came out and kicked Dreamer, knocking him down, and low-kicked Francine. He put Dreamer in the tarantula until Taz made the save. 5. Taz Peter Cierka. retained the ECW heavyweight title pinning Tajiri in 10:06. It wasn't bad, but something didn't click here. Taz has been pushed as such a killer that nobody bought Tajiri as a challenger. Tajiri did an Osai moonsault early. Taz blocked the tarantula and turned it into a power bomb. Taz threw all his good suplexes. Tajiri came back with good kicks, but Taz not only doesn't sell well, but when he does, people don't believe it. When he did the same combination of kicks that led to him laying Taz out in the angle to set up this match, nobody still believed Taz was hurt and there was no reaction to his kicking out of the pin. Tajiri was on the top rope and Taz shoved him off out of the ring and he landed on Rhino and Corino. Taz knocked Victory out of his wheelchair and then hit Victory with a chair. Taz power bombed Tajiri on the ramp. Tajiri came back with kicks to the chest with Taz daring him and not selling the kicks. He dared Tajiri to kick him in the chin. But when he did, Taz suplexed Tajiri over his head into a table that was vertical by the ropes. Taz chased Corino away. Taz came back, apparently with barbed wire. The cameras pulled far away, not sure why, because it came off like watching a WCW pay-per-view show when there is blood and people like ECW because they don't do those annoying things, and choked Tajiri out with it. The announcer screamed about how horrible it was what Taz was doing, but never actually said what it was that he was doing and the fans at home couldn't see it. 2.25 stars. 6. Rob Van Dam, Robert Sotkowski, and Jerry Lynn beat Lance Storm and Justin Credible, Peter Polacco, in 21:07. Joey Styles talked about Sonia Sotkowski, Rob's wife, at home watching the show recovering from her jet ski accident. A fan had a get well Sonia sign and they made a big deal out of it. Came off as a really classy gesture. The story of the match is that Credible would never get in the ring with Van Dam. As mentioned many times, Paul Heyman has kept them apart until getting national TV, feeling it would eventually be a big money program for him down the line. Van Dam made it all the way. Credible is probably realistically behind Storm, but Heyman still seems to be going with the plans. Most of the early portion was Van Dam against Storm and their wrestling was really good to set the pace. Credible hit Lynn with the cane to set up the heat spot. They worked on Lynn's face, selling the broken nose from the last pay-per-view. Credible used the outsider's edge, and they referenced him being friends with Scott Hall. Storm went off the top rope holding a chair, but Lynn dropkicked the chair into Storm's face. The spot sounds more spectacular than it looked. Van Dam hot tagged in and did all sorts of unique moves, including a twisting leg drop off the apron onto Storm, who was sprawled on the guardrail. Lynn bulldogged Credible off the top ropes onto the ramp. Van Dam missed a crossbody on the floor and sailed over the rail. He came back with a flip body block on Storm from off the guardrail. Credible used a reverse DDT on Lynn on the ramp. Storm got some near falls on Van Dam, but it was clear that fans didn't buy the possibility that Van Dam would get pinned no matter what he did, and they didn't react to the near falls. Van Dam did his tumbling senton on a chair on Storm for a near fall. Van Dam finally squared off with Credible, but Credible took a whip and took this bump over the top rope. Styles sold it that he'd rather take this crazy bump over the top than face Van Dam. It killed the bump, which was really good, and the explanation was kind of stupid, which Callis sort of pointed out. Van Dam went for the Raven drop toe hold onto the chair spot with Storm, but Storm actually missed the chair. Fonzie set up Credible for Van Dam to put him through the table. Sabu ran in at this point and put Credible through the table, stealing Van Dam's spot, so to speak. Van Dam did his 5-star frog splash, but Lynn ended up getting hit, but he kicked out. In a sloppily set up spot, Van Dam eventually hit the Van Daminator on Storm and Lynn used the cradle piledriver on him for the pin. After the match, Van Dam, Lynn and Sabu all started fighting each other over the circumstances of the finish. The least they could have done was lost the match to have a reason to be made. 3.75 stars. In what without question was the least looked forward to and perhaps historically the single most important UFC show in its history, the show ended with one major question. 2 members of the Nevada State Athletic Commission came to the show to inspect how UFC is done for possible approval of the sport and a planned December date in Las Vegas. It is generally believed that approval in Nevada would lead to virtually all the major cable companies in the United States carrying the show once again, which would almost surely take UFC from the brink of extinction in this country back to becoming a major player. So more than who won and lost, and what the buy rate was for this show, no doubt exceedingly low because neither DirecTV or USSB had operators on duty to even take phone calls, so unless you had an automatic device, it was impossible to order the show even if you had a dish, and virtually no pay-per-view companies carried it outside of Canada. The question was what the Nevada Commission members thought and would recommend. And there was a major problem. It wasn't the condition of Maurice Smith, who lost via TKO in a K1 match 41 days earlier, which created a minor controversy in the weeks leading up to the show. Smith appeared to be fine, which is more than can be said for his opponent, Marco Ruas, with Smith winning the main event when Ruas couldn't continue due to a knee injury after an uneventful first round. The problem was an undercard match with Japanese fighter Ryu Takase against Jeremy Horn. Takase weighed in at 168 pounds for a match with Horn, who had cut weight to make the 199-pound weight limit and was probably going into the octagon at well over 200 pounds. The Iowa Commission, which was governing the show, had a problem with the large weight differential, but reluctantly allowed the fight to go on after being told how Takase had beaten 680-pound Emmanuel Yarbrough in a match in Japan. Unfortunately, not only was there a huge size discrepancy, but once Horn got Takase to the ground, it was anything but pretty as he pummeled him with brutal knees and elbows from the mount position. It's one of those unanswered questions why Semaphore Entertainment Group would go to the expense of flying someone in from Japan and bring in someone who isn't one of the top-level fighters in that country, similar to bringing in an undersized Brazilian who was dominated earlier in the show by Paul Jones. Takase refused to tap, and referee Mario Yamasaki was late in stopping, perhaps partially due to criticism of him for what some thought was an early stoppage at the previous show. The end result was that Takase took a brutal beating and needed to be hospitalized after the show. Flip Omansky of the Nevada State Athletic Commission, along with the Iowa Commission, were said to be concerned with what happened, although Omansky did indicate at the show to reporters that he was by and large had a favorable reaction to the show. Nevada is expected to schedule a hearing over the next few weeks to decide the fate of UFC in that state, and possibly the fate of UFC at least as far as being a significant player. There was more than a smidgen of old-style pro wrestling at this show, held before a crowd of 3,000, about 2,200 paid, at the 7,000-seat Five Seasons Center in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Aside from the appearance of Ken Shamrock, given the night off by WWF, who announced on television that he would be taking time off from the WWF, while not everything is settled, at this point it looks like he'll be taking 1 year off, probably starting with UFC in December if that's the show in Las Vegas, to work both UFC and similar shoot and perhaps even work shoot type of events in Japan, and if anything else comes his way, to finish what he called unfinished business in UFC. It's a decision that makes a point. Shamrock would be leaving a lucrative pro wrestling career for 1 year and risking an already made reputation as a shooter earned during the pioneer days of what has been a rapidly changing sport. Shamrock, who last competed in December 1996 at the Ultimate, beating Brian Johnston before bowing out of the tournament due to a hand injury suffered in the match, before agreeing to join the WWF in late February of 1997, would because of his name value as a WWF star and his legend earned in the early UFCs when it was a huge hit on pay-per-view and in the home video market, would be a huge component of UFC putting itself back in the real game as far as being a major player on pay-per-view if it gets the cable bans reversed. At the age of 35, Shamrock realizes that if he's going to at any time go back to this world, that the time clock is ticking, and if he didn't do it now, it was never going to happen. He even talked on the show about having to prove that he still had what it took to be a top fighter or find out if he's too old. He said he enjoyed his WWF career and plugged his pay-per-view match with Steve Blackman. Shamrock had a 6-2-2 record in the early days of UFC, but both his draws, with Royce Gracie and Oleg Toktarov, had there been judges, would have been wins under today's standards, and one of his 2 losses, a split decision to Dan Severn, was more a match where nothing happened than one man actually beating the other. He was the first UFC Superfight champion, beating Severn with a guillotine to create that title, and then lost it to Severn on the split decision and never challenged for it again. He was often knocked for being a created superstar, having never won a UFC tournament. In the first UFC, he lost to Royce Gracie, and in 2 other tournaments, he never lost a match but bowed out of continuing due to injuries, and in the 16-man King of Pancrase tournament, despite being injured, he went out for the finals and won, although it was pretty clear in the early days of UFC that he and Gracie stood out in skill level above the rest of the fighters. But it is a completely different game now than it was at that time, as any viewing of videotapes will show. Exactly who Shamrock would face if he were to return has yet to be decided. UFC officials were bringing up names like Pedro Rizzo or Mark Coleman, while Shamrock appeared interested in Marco Ruas if he could beat Maurice Smith, which didn't happen, and it's doubtful Shamrock would face Smith since the two have been friends for years. But the old-style wrestling, reminiscent of early 80s territorial wrestling, were a pair of interview segments, one set up by the promotion and another that simply happened. UFC, largely due to efforts from Joe Silva, set up a face-to-face interview with Frank Shamrock and Tito Ortiz to use pro wrestling style hype to build up their middleweight title main event for the next pay-per-view on September 24th. With both in the octagon, Shamrock started doing an old-style cocky world champion interview reminiscent of a Harley Race or Ric Flair in that same time period, and in truth, he was, in his first interview of this style, already better at it than Race was with all his years of experience. Ortiz was not up to that level, but it really didn't matter, as he came off as a Ricky Steamboat-type babyface in the late 70s, just having to be humble and playing off a charismatic champion. It clearly worked live, as the crowd was into the confrontation, with Ortiz coming off as the natural babyface, which is something of an irony in many ways, and it was the best job UFC has done in building heat for a main event in years. But that wasn't all. I guess spurred on by the crowd reaction to the aforementioned segment, when Mikey Burnett was given interview time to issue a challenge to local fighter Pat Militic, who had just retained his lightweight title, he went several steps farther, setting up almost an Oklahoma, his native state, versus Iowa rivalry, calling the local fans nimrods and ignorant. He got tremendous heat, which seemed to build anticipation for the match, but turned off a lot of UFC regular viewers who don't like the idea of their sport turning into the hype circus of old-style pro wrestling. Earlier attempts by UFC fighters to incorporate pro wrestling-style interviews on the show, such as by Dan Severn, who didn't do it well, and Scott Ferrazzo, who did, never went over big with the core UFC audience, although one could say Tank Abbott's interviews were somewhat pro wrestling-oriented and he was UFC's most charismatic fighter for a long time. Burnett was not encouraged by UFC management to do this heel pro wrestler interview, although he was sitting with Ken Shamrock for most of the show, and that may have been where the seed of the idea was born. Ken Shamrock had before the show in the hotel had a legit confrontation with John Peretti, demanding Burnett to get a title shot at the winner of Militic vs. Andre Pederneiras. Peretti wasn't for the idea originally, but apparently after Semaphore Entertainment Group CEO Bob Merowitz liked the matchup, Peretti agreed to give Burnett the shot, although it probably won't happen until October, as Militic will probably miss the September show to rest a shoulder injury. This left Militic upset, feeling that because of Shamrock's pull, Burnett was getting special treatment that a regular fighter, like himself, in the same situation wouldn't be getting. The two had met once before in the match to determine the first lightweight champion back in October in Brazil, a match Militic won via split decision, largely because Burnett had a foul assessed against him for an inadvertent low knee. Burnett had been promised a title match if he beat Townsend Saunders, which he did, but Peretti had talked of putting Burnett in a different match before setting up the title match. Militic even threw a surprising barb during his interview after winning his match, saying he won the match for the local fans in Iowa, but not for the people on the internet who criticize him for being a boring fighter, trying to explain that reality is not always pretty. This was the first show since the rounds were implemented and where the power of the referees standing up fighters in stalemate positions was eliminated, and a new scoring system, boxing 10-point must system. For this show, they proved to neither be a change for better or worse as luck would have it. There were no lengthy stalemates on the ground and no close judges' decisions. There were many Japanese name fighters and pro wrestlers at the show because of the new UFC Japan group, which at this point is scheduled to run its debut show on September 23rd at Tokyo Yoyogi Gym 2, with Yoji Anjo looking to be the top draw and with a business affiliation with the Pancrase Group. A press conference to announce a lineup is scheduled for August. Also, several named fighters were in attendance because of Kosaka. Among those at the show besides Anjo were Yoshihisa Yamamoto, rings, Masayuki Naruse, rings, Kira Shoji, Pride, Kaoru Uno, Shudo, and Alexander Otsuka, Battle Arts. Travis Fulton beat David Dodd after 2 5-minute rounds by a unanimous decision. This match didn't air on the pay-per-view. 1. In something of a surprise and a really good match, Andre Roberts, the local Indian pro wrestler and a former high school wrestling champion, who looks nothing like a pro wrestler, meet Ron Waterman, a Colorado native who looks like a cross between Bill Goldberg and Steve Austin and was expected to win. Waterman was pounding Roberts with punch after punch standing, bloodying him up and breaking his nose again. Roberts, who trimmed down from 400 pounds in his loss to Gary Goodridge to 349, felt he'd been humiliated when Goodridge punched him in the nose and he quit in seconds. The doctor asked him if he wanted to continue despite all the blood loss, and he insisted he did. Waterman kept pounding him until Roberts caught him with almost a desperation punch which knocked him down. Waterman staggered up, but was hit with another hard punch to the jaw and knocked out at 3:01. This match actually didn't air on pay-per-view until after the main event because there was plenty of time remaining on the show. 2. Eugene Jackson beat Royce Alger at 1:19 of the second round. Alger, 34, was a former NCAA champion wrestler and a Golden Gloves winning boxer, but was not anywhere near his best shape. Jackson was a better striker, but Alger was able to take him down. Jackson was good enough to quickly escape and get back to his feet the first time, but the second time Alger mounted him and was punching away at him. Alger was hitting him with punch after punch, but Jackson managed to escape, and Alger looked gassed. Jackson came back and was staggering Alger, but the bell ending the round saved him. Alger took Jackson down twice more in the second round, but when Jackson escaped, he nailed Alger with a punch that knocked him silly and he tapped. This was also a really good match. 3. Tsuyoshi Kosaka of Rings in Japan defeated Tim Lasik when the towel was thrown in after the second round. Lasik, a former All-American wrestler with good boxing skills, proved to be a very difficult opponent for the highly regarded pro wrestler. Lajic seemed better standing, so Kosaka went for a takedown, but with Lajic's wrestling skills, he landed on top. Kosaka made a quick move into an ankle lock, but Lajic was quick to roll to escape. Lasik made life miserable for Kosaka with a forearm choke and got some shots in, opening a cut on Kosaka's eye and getting more strikes in. The second round saw Lasik use his wrestling to get the top position, but Kosaka held guard for most of the round. Toward the latter stages, it appeared Lasik, one of those overly muscular specimens, was starting to tire. Kosaka reversed him and started striking with good combinations, mainly elbows to the ribs and head, one of which knocked Lasik silly. When the bell rang to end the round, Lasik was dazed on the ground and his corner threw in the towel. Another good match. 4. Paul Jones of the USWF out of Amarillo beat Flavio Luis Moura of Brazil in 4:21. Jones, a former All-American wrestler, took the much smaller. Jones weighed 198 to Moura's 175, Moura down. But Moura was really flexible and moved quickly on the bottom. Still, Jones hit punches, forearms and elbows, connecting a lot until Moura turned and Jones clamped on the choke for the submission. Jones looked impressive in the win, but it was one-sided. 5. Jeremy Horn beat Ryu Takase in 4:44. Horn used his size advantage to dominate the game. Japanese fighter who took a terrible beating before ref Mario Yamasaki stopped the fight. Takase was bleeding from the eye from the pounding, largely elbows, and was in very rough shape when it was over. 6. Pat Miletic retained the lightweight title, beating Andre Pederneiras at 2:20 of the second round. Pederneiras is a jiu-jitsu specialist, but Miletic was able to use his balance from wrestling to keep the match on their feet and won the first round with his superior striking technique. In the second round, Miletic landed a strong punch and Pederneiras was opened up badly with a heavy flow of blood near the eye and the match was stopped. 7. Maurice Smith beat Marco Ruiz when Ruiz couldn't come out for the second round. The battle of former UFC stars saw Smith, 38, topple Ruiz. Billed at 38 but most likely is really in his early 40s. Apparently Ruiz had twisted his knee 5 days before the fight. When he came into the octagon, he had a look on his face that you could see he knew he wasn't going to win. He shot the knee up before the fight with painkillers. Smith threw some leg kicks early but Ruiz took him down and the match was largely a stalemate. Ruiz went for a leg lock but Smith broke it with a hard punch. When the round ended, Ruiz was on his back, as the shot was wearing off and his corner threw in the towel. From a spectator standpoint, this was a poor main event as Smith didn't look impressive before Ruiz couldn't continue. With the main booking power and television formatting in the hands of Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff with Kevin Nash only having a minor role, Nitro on July 19 presented an angle-laden show with 2 marquee main events and introducing a slew of new characters, new announcer and celebrity cameo appearances in front of an incredibly rabid crowd in Rockford, Illinois. While it was generally considered the best Nitro in a long time, the ratings told a different story. A rather ordinary episode of WWF Sports Entertainment, as the show is now categorized, drew a 6.28 rating, 6.05 first hour, 6.55 seconds hour, and a whopping 10.0 share. Nitro drew a 3.33 rating, 3.57 first hour, 3.11 seconds hour, 3.31 third hour, and a 5.5 share. Over the head-to-head 2 hours and 8 minutes, Raw's 6.28 compared to Nitro's 3.21, or just shy of doubling the rating head-to-head. Raw doubled Nitro in 4 of the 8 quarters head-to-head, including devastating Nitro in the battle of main events, overrun. The disappointment for Nitro had to be the performance of the 2 marquee matches. The Hogan vs. Vicious title match drew a 2.91 final quarter, growing to a 3.51 overrun with all the run-ins including Goldberg, but even that is misleading high since it went longer than Raw. Raw's final quarter, Pac and Kane vs. Big Show and Holly match and the beginning of Undertaker vs. Triple H in comparison did a 6.96 rating, and the overrun, with the finish of that match and the Austin run-in built throughout the show, did a 7.70 rating, and that's a rating totally opposed, making it the most watched wrestling match with opposition wrestling programming in the history of cable television. Nitro's other marquee match, the Ric Flair vs. Sting match for Troll of the Company, was a huge disappointment, drawing just a 3.35 rating for the first opposed quarter as compared to the 5.33 for the same Raw open as every week. Unlike the previous week for Flair vs. Malenko, where Flair maintained the audience from the unopposed quarter, the Flair-Sting match had the usual turn-off factor when Raw began, falling from a 4.07 unopposed rating. Raw's numbers throughout the evening were consistent until the big pickup in the last 23 minutes. Nitro's numbers ranged from a low of 2.73 for Rick Steiner vs. Horace Hogan and Eddie Guerrero vs. Psychosis to a high of 3.69 for the post-match after Savage vs. Kidman with the Rodman run-in and Melee and the Conan vs. Vampiro match. Scott Hudson replaced Tony Schiavone as host of Nitro with no explanation given on the air, and it was made clear Schiavone was there because he and Mike Tenay both come out with microphones for no apparent reason during the Rodman-Savage angle. Hudson was told while in the studios on July 16 doing the Saturday night taping for the next day to come to Nitro, but not told why. He wasn't told until 6 p.m. that night by Bischoff that they wanted him to host the show. Bischoff had earlier told Schiavone that afternoon they wanted him to take a break, which Schiavone was none too thrilled about. On the air, Hudson opened the show with Bobby Heenan and no mention was made as to why. The official company line is that this is a 2-week experiment, but with Schiavone's work roundly being criticized and Hudson bringing an air of freshness to the show based on the first week and the almost unanimous reaction to it, this change looks to be more than temporary. For the weekend of July to 17th of July 18th, Livewire did a 1.2 rating, its lowest of the year by far, with no plausible explanation since the other WWF shows did at their usual level. Superstars did a 1.8 and Sunday Night Heat did a 3.86 rating and WCW Saturday Night did a 1.7. Thunder moved to Wednesday this past week, July 14th, with little hype to that fact, fell to a miserable 2.14 rating. Our 4th annual Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame issue will be dated August 16th. This has over the past 4 years turned into one of the most popular issues of the year and also the issue that traditionally creates the most controversy and debate. Our ballots were already sent out to a group of named current and former performers in the industry along with a few longtime reporters and historians. For those who have received a ballot and wish to participate, we will be tabulating these ballots on August 5th, so please mail within a few days or fax or phone in by August 4th at the latest. We have a somewhat complicated system in an attempt to do justice to performers from all over the world, broken down into the 3 major wrestling regions, United States and Canada/Mexico/Japan. A person needs 60% of the vote from people who are familiar with that region to be elected in. To be eligible for the balloting, a performer must either be 35 years old or 15 years must have passed since their debut in the business. The names on the ballot consisted of new candidates who reached one of those milestones this year, new candidates who were overlooked on last year's ballot, and people who got at least 10% of the vote last year. Similar to the Baseball Hall of Fame, electors are allowed to vote for as many as 10 candidates per annual election, but they can vote for as few as 0. All balloting results, for obvious reasons having to do with the unique politics of this industry, are kept totally confidential. The names on the list this year are Lou Albano, Arn Anderson, Ole Anderson, Linus Asuka, Bob Backlund, Eric Bischoff, Cien Caras, Masahiro Chono, Carlos Colon, Terry Gordy, Chavo Guerrero, Gran Hamada, Folk Han, Hiroshi Hazi, Shinya Hashimoto, Michael Hayes, Curtis Aokia, Cactus Jack, Conan, Jushin Liger, Lizmark, Wahoo McDaniel, Shawn Michaels, Bill Miller, Gorilla Monsoon, Fabulous Moolah, Dick Murdoch, Keiji Muto, Bull Nakano, Jim Ross, Masa Saito, Seiji Sakaguchi, El Satanico, Ken Shamrock, Tiger Jeet Singh, Sergeant Slaughter, Jimmy Snuka, Wilbur Snyder, Undertaker, Kerry Von Erich, and Steve Williams. Albano, Ole Anderson and Cologne were omissions, more inadvertent than anything else, from last year's ballot, which was the first one put up to an election. Eligible for the first time this year are Chono, Hashimoto, Conan, Liger, Michaels, Nakano, and Shamrock. Last year only Dos Caras, picking up 72% of the vote, made the Hall of Fame. Both Muto, 58%, and Cactus Jack, 57%, came exactly 1 vote shy of inclusion last year. The remainder of the top 10 from last year's balloting was Saito, 53%, Asuka, 53%, McDaniel, 50%, Murdoch, 50%, Hamada, 44%, Ozzy, 42%, and Gordy, Undertaker, Guerrero and Lizmark, all 39%. Japanese television rundown. June 26, New Japan. 1. Genichiro Tenryu pinned Shinya Hashimoto in 14-11. This match saw the two guys just stand there and trade stiff chops and kicks the entire way. People were oohing at the blows, so they were probably impressive, although stiffness doesn't come across nearly as good on television as it does live. Last year at G1 they did the same match and it was one of the best matches of the year, but this time with Hashimoto so much smaller, it seemed too predictable. Tenryu won with a chop off the ropes. 2.5 stars. 2. Kendo Kashin won the Super Juniors tournament over Koji Kanemoto in 13-15. Some great mat wrestling early and Kanemoto used his really wicked kicks. Kashin dropped Kanemoto with a German suplex on his head. Kashin pulled a large metal briefcase and used it as a foreign object, which seemed to be the first sense of the juniors abandoning the great pure wrestling format. At one point Kanemoto hit the moonsault and when he went down for the pin, was caught with an armbar out of nowhere and the crowd popped for the rope break, figuring it as a possible finish. After a few more armbar teases, Kashin got one in the middle for the submission. Good match, but a letdown for the tournament final and for a Kanemoto singles match. 3.25 stars. Mexico. The Ocesa pay-per-view show on July 17 at the 30,000-seat Palacio de los Deportes in Mexico City drew only 8,000 fans for the Ruleta de la Muerte 2, which was a 16-man losers advance tournament, with the ultimate loser getting stripped of their mask. What actually happened was they started with a battle royal, and based on order of elimination, tag teams would be formed. First guy eliminated and second were a team, third and fourth were a team, etc. The final losing tag team would be forced into a singles match and the ultimate loser gets unmasked. There were some major name masks out there including Elio Del Santo, La Parca, Villano Tercero, Blue Panther, Atlantis, Tinieblas Sr. and Jr. and Fuerza Guerrera. The tournament itself came down to the final losers of Blue Panther and Olympico beating Shocker and Rey Bucanero when Bucanero somehow accidentally caused Shocker to get pinned. This led to their singles match with Bucanero scoring a pin with his feet on the ropes, but the ref ordered the match restarted and Shocker won via submission with a backbreaker over the knee. Bucanero unmasked, revealing his name as Arturo Ortiz, the nephew of Francisco Ortiz, Pirata Morgan, from Mexico City. Also on that show, after Apollo Dantes and Mascara Ano 2000 and Cien Caras and Scorpio Jr. beat Negro Casas and Super Astro Emilio Charles Jr. and Brazo de Plata, Pierroth Jr. and his Puerto Rican group, only one member of which is actually Puerto Rican, which draws great heat since they are thus Mexican traders group, is Ricky Santana. Gran Marquez Jr., Villano Tercero, Pierroth Jr. and Fuerza Guerrera hit the ring and Santana and Pierroth bloodied up Dantes after hitting him with a beer bottle and he did a stretcher job. Early in the show they held a ceremony honoring El Satanico for the 25th anniversary of his pro debut. AAA on July 18 in Monterrey had a cage match where the final guy left in the cage would lose either his hair or mask, with Jerry Estrada, Latin Lover, El Sanguinario and the Panther ending with Sanguinario losing his hair. Espectro Jr. regained the Mexican national middleweight title from Mascara Sagrada Jr. on July 8 in Toluca. The EMLL major show of the week on July 16 at Arena Mexico drew what was described as a poorhouse with Santo and Casas and Mr. Niebla over Pierroth Jr. and Shocker, finally wrestling on the Rudo side, and Santana by a DQ when IWRG Mr. Niebla showed up again and helped Shocker unmask the original Niebla. There are many reasons for Arena Mexico generally not drawing well, with the exception of the week where they had Silva versus Kurgan in the top feud. For one, it can't be emphasized enough about how dangerous the part of Mexico City where the building is located is. Also, the top program they've been pushing of late is Shocker versus Niebla, and people just don't take those two as headliners yet. Also, because of American television getting into Mexico and changing the taste of fans, the main events, usually 15 to 25 minutes in the past, have been cut way back. Both the main event and semifinal on July 16 were less than 7 minutes for best-of-3 fall matches. The July 18 show at Arena Coliseo, which drew a packed house of 5,500, drew a lot more than the big show of the week. Kanan, Rey Mysterio Jr., Rey Mysterio, Psicosis, Yokozuna and Nikozuna all headline in Tijuana on July 22. IWRG's tournament to create a number one contender for their IC heavyweight champ Pierroth Jr. for a match on August 1 comes down to Morgan versus Mascara Sagrada on July 25. Morgan beat Super Parka on July 11 in one semifinal and Sagrada beat Maniac Cop on July 18 in the other. They did something really weird on July 4th in Guadalajara for the big AAA TV taping. They pushed the show heavily as the return of Hector Garza. Garza wasn't there, but they still pushed him as being there on television, and had a graphic for him, and it wound up with a 3 versus 4 main event. Pena has created a new mini character a few weeks back called Andre the Mini. All Japan. There were a couple of different lineups this week. On July 13th in Matsudo before a sellout 2,650, they had the Burning Group vs. Untouchables Best of 3 series, with the matchups made that day. Mitsuharu Misawa first beat Kentaro Shigai in 8:09 with the Tiger Driver. Kenta Kobashi evened it up for Burning, pinning Masahito Kakihara with a lariat in 11:58. Burning won the series when Jun Akiyama pinned Yoshinari Ogawa in 17:55 with his Exploder. On July 17th at Korakuen Hall they had a singles match with Toshiaki Kawada beating Yoshihiro Takayama in 6:50 when he kicked him hard in the face and Takayama fell out of the ring and couldn't return. Don't know if this was a planned finish, because All Japan hasn't done a countout finish probably in close to 9 years. Main on that show saw Misawa and Ogawa beat Kobashi and Jinsei Shinzaki in 2032 when Ogawa used his figure 4 jackknife pin on Shinzaki. On July 19th in Matsumoto, they had 2 key singles matches with Kawada pinning Shinzaki in 14:06 after a powerbomb, and Vader pinned Akira Taue in 7:42 clean. Kawada's wins were to set him up as a challenger for Misawa's Triple Crown on July 23rd at Budokan Hall, show which sold out well in advance. Vader had been kept away from main events largely at his own request on this tour, feeling he needed to lay low a tour so he isn't burned out too early working with the big names, and plus it's easier physically because of the demands being less working a mid-card match than a main event here. The major criticism of Misawa as a booker is that he's not good at long-term planning. While Kenta Kobashi's losing streak in tag matches since coming back with the nose injury was snapped last week, they did a big surprise finish on July 20th in Gosen when Takawamori and Yoshihiro Takayama and Satoru Asako beat the Burning Trio when Asako pinned Kobashi for the first big win of his career. Bart Gunn will change his ring name starting on the next tour. It's a legal issue as his WWF contract expires at the end of the month. No word on what his new name will be. There will be a long break until August 21st after Budokan. The big shows on the next tour will be August 21st and August 22nd at Korakuen Hall, August 25th in Hiroshima, August 28th in Kyoto, August 29th at Osaka City Chuo Gymnasium, which has to be a major show, August 30th at Hakata Star Lanes, and September 4th back at Budokan Hall. New Japan. The first of the 2 straight nights for the final New Japan shows ever at Sapporo Nakajima Sports Center drew a sellout 6,500 on July 20th for what was essentially a one-match show. In that match, Keiji Muto retained the IWGP Heavyweight title beating usual tag team partner Satoshi Kojima in 23:10 with a figure 4 leglock. Early reports were the match was disappointing. The only other match announced so far behind Great Muta vs. Great Nita for the August 28th Jingu Baseball Stadium show is Scott Norton vs. Don Fry. The two are friends in real life, but the match is very intriguing, not the least of which because on paper it looks like a very difficult match to pull off. Not only is there the question of who goes over, but Fry needs to be carried by either a great shoot-style worker or someone with a good amateur background for his matches to get over, while Norton also needs to be carried. Japanese fans think of both guys as tough, but with 2 foreigners against each other, sometimes fans are cold to the match. The July 21st Sapporo main event, which is the final New Japan show until the G1 Climax tournament, was changed to Masahiro Chono and Atsushi Onita and Akira vs. Muto and Hiro Saito and Hiroyoshi Tenzan, so Muto and Onita can work spots to build heat for their stadium show. Onita is doing a storyline that he won't be available for the August 28th show because he's going to be busy promoting his own show on August 22nd in the Ariake section of Tokyo with an explosive barbed wire match. Chono claimed that as soon as Onita was announced as wrestling that ticket sales for the show picked up. Onita returned from a trip to Mongolia on July 16th and was to appear on a high school students' quiz show. Onita's gained a lot of mainstream pub for returning to high school to get his degree largely as a publicity stunt. It's considered a virtual lock that Riki Choshu will be coming back for a match with Onita, probably on January 4th at the Tokyo Dome. Choshu as much as admitted it in a magazine interview. From a mainstream name recognition standpoint, some would say that Onita and Choshu are probably the most famous Japanese wrestlers of all time behind the big three. Rikitozen, Baba and Inoki. Kenzo Suzuki is scheduled to leave for Calgary on July 25th to train under Joe Daigo, and later train at the WCW power plant. Other Japan notes. Akira Hokuto Hisako Uno Sasaki, wife of Kensuke Sasaki, one of the 2 or 3 greatest women wrestlers who ever lived, returned to action doing a run-in on the July 18th show at Korakuen Hall. Hokuto, who has been out of action since becoming pregnant with her first child, returned after Asia Kong and Mayumi Ozaki had lost the WWA tag titles in a surprise to Sugar Sato and Chikeo Nagashima. Hokuto, 32, who was AJW's biggest star during its early 90s popularity peak and the top draw for the Tokyo Dome show in 1994, which drew 42,500 fans, ran down the state of women's wrestling in Japan and said she'd spark life back into it and ran down Chigusa and Nagio. It appears that Hokuto will join the heel group in Gia with Kong, Ozaki and Lina Sasuka against Nagio and Nagio's proteges, probably starting with an August 15th show at Korakuen Hall. The Gia show drew a crowd announced at a sellout 2,200 and from live reports it was legitimately full. All Japan Women ran the same building that afternoon and drew a crowd estimated at maybe 800. Yasha Kurenai, 29, had her retirement match on July 20th at Korakuen Hall before a crowd announced at 1,813. Kurenai lost to Shinobu Kondori via submission in her finish match. However, after the match, Carol Midori came out and said Kurenai would have to wrestle her as well, and Midori beat her. Kurenai, real name Rumi Yasuda, joined All Japan Women for training in January 1988 and debuted in December at Korakuen Hall. She wrestled there for 2 years before quitting. She started with LLPW on its debut show on August 29, 1992 and has been with the promotion ever since, changing her name to Yasha Kurenai, doing a Japanese soldier gimmick in 1993, working as a heel, and during her career held the LLPW Women's 6-man titles, AJW's All-Pacific title and All Japan's Japanese Tag Team title. She's retiring to get married. FMW opened its tour on July 18th in East Osaka, beginning a tournament to crown World Entertainment Wrestling 6-man champs. The first night saw Koto Fuyuki and Koji Nakagawa and Gedo draw with Hayabusa and Masato Tanaka and Tetsuhiro Kuroda over 30 minutes, so each team got 1 point. Also in the tournament are Armageddon 1 and 2, I believe 2 masked Samoans, and Super Leather and Jado and Yukihiro Kanemura and Mr. Ganasuke. There's a lot of talk that the Naoya Ogawa vs Yoshihisa Yamamoto match in August, instead of being a ring-style match, will be a jungle death match similar to the famous matches in the past with Antonio Inoki vs Masa Saito and Hiroshi Hashi vs Tiger Jeet Singh. JD on July 21st in Kawasaki has a match where Yugo Kosugi faces Shark Tsuchiya, and if Tsuchiya loses, she has to retire. UFO is said to be having financial problems, which explains why they haven't even announced a next show. Toriuman ran Yokohama Bunka Gym on July 16th for the final show of the current tour. They claimed a sellout of 5,280, but no way possible. Main event saw Shima Nobunaga and Sumo Fuji and Yoshikazu Taru beating Magnum Tokyo and Taka Michinoku and Kenichiro Arai in their typical real long match. Michinoku Pro is doing its World Masked Man tournament, which started on July 17th. Dirt Bike Kid from England was injured on the first night of the tour and apparently is done from the tour. One of the masked men on this tour is a British wrestler named Jody Fleisch, 18, who is said to be comparable to Blitzkrieg in WCW when it comes to acrobatic moves. Ric Flair and the Destroyer are going to Japan together for a tour from July 26 to August 3 for a series of youth wrestling matches, which Reed Flair will be a member of the American team that Dick Bayer is coaching and Rick is going along. Told that the recent Big Japan Deathmatch title match with Shadow WX vs Ryuji Yamakawa saw a mistake where they were using the fluorescent light bulb tubing and Yamakawa actually got the tube stuck so deeply in his back that you could put your finger in the hole in Yamakawa's back and it would cover the knuckle. AJW had a show at its gym in Tokyo on July 20th and Momoi Nakanishi did the Iron Woman deal for her birthday. She actually turned 19 on July 7th, where 8 women rotated against her for 1-minute matches until she did 21-minute matches, winning 6, losing 4 and having 10 draws. Here and there. ESPN magazine is working on an article regarding the legitimate sports background of some of the top wrestlers. You know, Rock played college football at Miami, Randy Savage played minor league baseball, and Goldberg played in the NFL. Jim Cornette has started working with Dan Briley for the NWA Ohio Valley Championship Wrestling promotion, doing booking and putting together television. The WWF is going to send some talent to this group as kind of a Class A promotion, leading to sending them to Memphis, which would be the step leading to WWF. Rico Cosentino from Southern California is the first WWF trainee coming in, and a few others are expected. Barry Buchanan, Recon of the Truth Commission and Punisher in Smoky Mountain Wrestling, may head in as well. For September 25th at the NWA 51st Anniversary Show in Charlotte, it looks like they'll headline with a triangle match for the NWA title with Naoya Ogawa, Dan Severn, and someone to be named. Names thrown out have included UFO Big Van Vader, and also Steve Williams. There may be an NWA title change soon since the US members want a champion who means something in this country. Williams is under contract to WWF, although they aren't using him, but would fit the bill of what the organization wants as a guy who means something in both the US and Japan and also has a legitimate reputation. WWF had talked of using Williams again in the fall, which would certainly lessen the odds of being able to put that together. The Dallas Morning News on July 18 did a feature noting it as the 11th anniversary of the death of Bruiser Brody. The story was not all that favorable regarding Brody, with quotes from former WCCW general manager and booker Ken Lusk. Mantell, talking about how Brody often walked out on bookings, agreed to when getting a better offer elsewhere, and talked about him making people look bad in the ring, pointing in particular at Solomon Grundy when he was first breaking in. For all that talk about the prohibitive costs of doing the drug testing and screening in Oregon, which the WWF's Jim Byrne claimed would be $1,000 per wrestler and claimed they'd bring 100 to 150 performers to Oregon for a show, making it out that the total cost would be well into six figures just to run one house show. Brian Alvarez, who does Figure 4 newsletter and wrestles independently in the Northwest, just got his Oregon license the past week, and the total cost was $121.20 for the license, $25 for a visit to the doctor, $25 for a hepatitis B test, $21 for an HIV test, $15 for a lab handling fee, and $15 for a fee for taking blood. If you figure about 30 to 40 performers per show, you are talking an expense for the big companies of less than $5,000 in total. Due to Shane Douglas signing with WCW and Chris Jericho with WWF, the planned singles match main event between the two for the July 30th Brian Hildebrand benefit show in Rostraver, Pennsylvania is out. It looks to be Douglas and Chris Benoit and Dean Malenko versus Chris Condito and Tracy Smothers and Tim Horner, Jericho versus Terry Taylor, Al Snow versus D'Lo Brown, Eddie Guerrero versus Cody Michaels, plus Public Enemy Wrestling. Mick Foley is still recovering from double knee surgery, so won't be wrestling or refereeing on the show, but will make an appearance signing autographs and the like. NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw was filming California Championship Wrestling this past week for a feature, air date not yet determined, on small-time wrestlers with big dreams. It appears MTV's documentary on wrestling will air on August 14th. It'll be a feature on a young man training to become a wrestler at Leigh Thatcher's school, the lifestyle of two current superstars, Hunter Hearst Helmsley and China, and a former star finishing up his career, Tony Atlas, because of his win over Randy Hales. The storyline in Memphis is that Kevin Lawler, is now the heel matchmaker for television. On the July 17th show, Christian reinstated Doug Gilbert. Derek King is now wrestling as Tay-Hi. Siren, the clueless valet of Kid Wicked, got her real job plugged on TV as Wicked said if you didn't believe she was hot, you should go to Mount Moriah BL, where the strip club that she works at is located. They set up a feud of Tommy Rich versus Wolfie D when Christian instigated it, saying that the fake part of wrestling is guys like that pretending to be friends when they have heat. Reggie B. Fine returned. When J.R. Smooth and the BSK group were cutting a promo, he said he was begging Vince McMahon to hurry up and take us out of this place. Christian announced Gilbert versus Randy Hales at the New Daisy Theater that night. Gilbert said that Christian was pulling a con and said while he hated Hales, he hates Christian and his entire family even more, grabbed Christian by the tie, and Christian ran off. Nationally syndicated humor columnist Dave Barry did a column on July 18th on attending a Florida Championship Wrestling show. The first wrestling show in many years in Nassau, Bahamas, using mainly Florida indie wrestlers with the biggest name being Marty Jannetty, only drew about 125 fans at Nassau Stadium. RF video of P.O. Box 797, Langhorne, Pennsylvania 19047 has a 2-tape 8-hour combination shoot interview and career highlights of Vader for $35. There are a ton of inside stories about behind the scenes in WWF, WCW and Japan on this tape. Mid-American Wrestling on August 21st in Milwaukee at Wilson Park has Ian Rotten vs. Axel Rotten plus Sherry Martel appearing. Ricky Johnson in Ontario is now billing himself as the People's Uncle. Ricky Johnson is half-brother of Rocky Johnson. AWA on July 31st in Ionia, Michigan at the fair has Tatanka, Greg Valentine, Sherry Martel, and August 13th in Jackson, Michigan at the county fair has Little Undertaker and Mini Stone Cold along with Sherry Martel. Dwayne Gill as Gilbert has been defending the WWF light heavyweight title on indie shows, so maybe this title will go the way of the old WWF light heavyweight title of the 80s. That title, originally developed by then WWF President Hisashi Shinma for Gran Hamada, wound up never being acknowledged by the WWF and was a regular Mexican title that was occasionally defended in Japan, until the WWF figured it out and threatened legal action like 15 years later. Melbourne businessman Peter Skapetis, a former jobber for Jim Barnett's old World Championship Wrestling promotion in Australia, is running with Mark Lewin, who was a huge star in that country in the WCW era, as the booker and public face of the company. They've drawn very successful houses in Melbourne and less successful houses in Sydney. Some of the shows in smaller cities have been cancelled already due to lack of local promotion. On the tour are DOA, the Pitbulls, Nails, Headhunters, in some cities billed as the Abdullah Brothers from Sudan, Brute Force, John Cronus, the Italian Giant, Primo Carnera Tercero, Canadian Tiger, Mike Lazansky Sedmon Spartacus, from Dallas, and Mexicans Antifaz del Norte and Zorro. The world champion is called the High-Risk Warrior, Luminius the Magnificent from Dallas, a Jim Hellwig ripoff. The only Australian being used is Mark Mercedes, a former Malenko Brothers protege. They have their own television show on Sunday nights on Channel 9, one of the biggest stations in the country. Another Australian group, the Australasian Wrestling Federation, debuted on July 15, built around cruiserweight high flyers. Melbourne natives going by the name Chucky vs. Cobra supposedly had the best match in Australia in years on the debut card. They claim to be doing a tour of New South Wales and Victoria from August 26 to August 30 using Sabu, 2 Cold Scorpio and Marty Jannetty, along with bringing in Super Dragon from California and Gothic Knight from Calgary. Mick Foley, while recuperating from injuries, was in Australia from July 16 to July 20, attracting large crowds and drawing favorable press coverage for all his public appearances. He also made an in-ring appearance at the July 17 High Risk Championship Wrestling show in Melbourne. MMA. Dream Sports Entertainment held a press conference this past week which was thought to be an announcement of some matches for the next Pride show on September 12 in Yokohama, but instead it was simply a 30th birthday party for Kazushi Sakuraba. At the party, Nobuhiko Takada talked about wanting to face Hoist or Hickson Gracie again on that show, but said he wasn't interested in facing Ogawa. The promotion gave Sakuraba the MVP award at the press conference. Still haven't seen the complete July 4th show but did see the first 3 matches. Karl Malenko vs. Ian Inoue saw Malenko use his wrestling to take Inoue down, and most of the match saw them trade a few strikes and grapple a ton while on the ground with Malenko on top, and he won the decision in 25 minutes. It was pretty good technically for what it was, but not really much of a spectator match. Carlos Newton vs. Daijiro Matsui was a really good match. Newton is about 180, he's apparently going to trim down to 170 to do the lightweight class, and Matsui seemed to have him by 20 pounds, but Newton was a better competitor. Size matters, and they went back and forth throughout the 20 minutes regulation. Newton had the advantage with some good punches standing in the overtime to get the decision. The Carlos Barreto vs. Igor Vovchanchyn match was pretty boring. Barreto is about 6'5" and Vovchanchyn is 5'10". Most of the match was standing, and Vovchanchyn is the more experienced kickboxer, but Barreto had decent skills standing and all that reach, so they largely nullified each other. Vovchanchyn bled from under the eyes in the first round. Second round was a stalemate. It was ruled a draw after that round and sent to overtime. Overtime saw Barreto on top in the guard and not much happened there. How Vovchanchyn got the decision, a split decision, if they were even after regulation is beyond me. Boss Rutten was planning on fighting Tito Ortiz for the middleweight title, presumed to be vacant since the idea was Shamrock wasn't coming back, when Frank Shamrock got back in the picture. Rutten, the heavyweight champ, is planning on vacating the title and going after the middleweight crown, probably being next in line for the Shamrock-Ortiz winner. Rutten got a lesson about fighting a bigger, stronger guy in the match with Kevin Randleman, but now we hear that Randleman also wants to cut to the middleweight division because that's where Rutten and all the action is. Rutten was 203 for his match with Randleman, so he's a natural middleweight. Randleman went into the fight at 218, and has experience cutting weight since he wrestled in college at 165, so he could make 199 like Ortiz, who looks to be about 230 now and cuts to 199 and replenishes liquids back to about 217 by the time he's in the octagon. Shamrock did sign a contract with Semaphore Entertainment Group that has exclusivity. Shamrock would be able to buy fight elsewhere as long as he publicly announces his retirement from UFC and vacates the title belt. I don't know how UFC Japan, which is looking to push Shamrock as well as a top star, fits into that, because it would be UFC but they are two different companies just sharing the same initials. UFC Japan tried to buy the Shamrock vs. Ortiz fight from Bob Merowitz, but Merowitz wanted it for US pay-per-view. As things stand, UFC Japan events would not air on pay-per-view in the United States. At Sakuraba's birthday party, he told the press his proposed match with Shamrock wouldn't be taking place due to Shamrock signing to fight in UFC instead. At the post-show party after the UFC event, there was a lengthy discussion between Ken and Frank, which was noted by just about everyone since over the past year, plus the two really didn't have much of a relationship and didn't talk when both were at the same shows. Part of the discussion, which amicable, regarded mending fences. Part regarded Ken being upset that Frank was using the name Shamrock Sports for marketing endeavors, including sending a cease and desist on the name, a name that Ken previously used in the early 90s. Some of it was regarding working together on business. Dan Severn drew with Nick Starks, who did some pro wrestling for Kingdom in Japan, in the main event of a show called Ultimate Reality Fighting on July 18th in Orlando, Florida. The word going around is the match was a work and fans didn't like it. K1 sold out Nagoya Rainbow Hall on July 18th with 10,000 fans, with Peter Aerts beating Sam Greco via knockout with a right-footed kick to the head in 1:38 of the second round. The other main event saw Ernesto Hust score a TKO over Igor Vovchanchyn, a former Russian kickboxer who has gained more fame of late in MMA competition. Hust used leg kicks to wear Vovchanchyn down and scored 3 knockdowns. Vovchanchyn had challenged both Takada and Naoya Ogawa in the Japanese press this past week. Both main events were said to have been good. There was also an 8-man tournament with the winner getting into the K1 Grand Prix later in the year, won by Stefan Liko of Germany. The next K1 show will be August 22nd at Tokyo Ariake Coliseum, where Kazuyoshi Ishii will be debuting a 6'10" Chinese fighter who will be billed as Shohei, as in Baba's real first name. The guy is said to look like Baba. They are also doing a big angle in the press since Ishii is going to the US to visit with Don King and Matt Tinley about co-promotional deals, and in Japan they are trying to position it as if Ishii is attempting to book Mike Tyson for K1, which of course is ridiculous on so many levels. Not the least of which is the current non-relationship between Tyson and King to begin with. Got a lot more notes on Satoru Sayama's Kakitamishi Promotions debut show on July 11th in Okinawa. It was the first show of its kind ever to take place in Okinawa and drew a sellout 4,500 fans. According to reports from people involved with working the show, the promoters treated the fighters as kings and it was very well received. Sayama's match with Minoru Tanaka, as expected, was a work. The show included both kickboxing, boxing and MMA-style matches. The crowd was said to be about 25% American at the show. Boss Rutan was there as a referee. The next show in Okinawa is scheduled for December. ECW. Sonia Sotkowski, Rob Van Dam's wife, is still in the hospital in Orlando and faces a long recovery, as it's believed it'll be a year before she'll be able to walk. She suffered a broken femur and a smashed knee in the jet ski accident last week as the couple was on the lake with Sabu. It'll be probably another 2 weeks before she can even return home. The couple lives in Los Angeles. They underwent 3 surgeries this past week, the major one lasting 4.5 hours, which included having a steel rod inserted into her femur and a steel plate just below the knee. ECW dedicated the pay-per-view show to her, largely because of a Get Well Sonia sign in the front row at the pay-per-view, at which point the decision was made to acknowledge the accident on the show. The couple is covered insurance-wise since Van Dam signed an employee's contract with ECW as opposed to the independent contractors, which gives full medical benefits to the employee and their families. Taz and Just Incredible have also signed similar deals. The plan for now is that the early TNN shows will consist of 3 fast-paced matches, with bouts the likes of Van Dam vs. Spike Dudley, Yoshihiro Tajiri vs. Super Crazy, or 3-ways with Little Guido, Jerry Lynn vs. Just Incredible or Lance Storm, etc., along with minimal interviews and character development. Van Dam will be billed as the longest reigning singles champion in pro wrestling, which as far as major organizations go in this country or Japan, it would be. There are probably some in Mexico that date farther back than April 4, 1998, when he beat Bigelow for the TV title. And they are going to try and come up with a number, whether real or just an approximate estimation like WCW did with Goldberg, of straight title defenses to try and start him off to new fans with a Goldberg-like streak. Sabu won't be appearing in matches early on, trying to sell him based on intrigue of not seeing him and building a reputation by showing clips of past ECW matches showing him going over in spots the likes of Arn Anderson, Terry Funk, Shane Douglas, Bigelow, Malenko, Benoit and others who have national reps. Mike Awesome is being talked with. Awesome is committed to the next All Japan tour and has a deal if he wants it to work as a full-timer with that group. Heyman is pitching to get him as a full-timer but doesn't want to use him as a part-timer, with ECW being his second priority job. New Jack will be used once in a while for surprise run-ins, according to Heyman. Taz vs. Tajiri for the title will likely take place on the August 26 TNN tapings in Queens, New York. Joel Gertner will work with Joey Styles as the announcing team for the TNN shows. It's something of a debatable decision. Gertner is great at delivering pre-planned lines for short interviews, but there's a big difference between that and thinking on your feet and not running out of things to say for a 60-minute television show. Currently, ECW's PPVs are ranging from 77,000 to 85,000 buys, which is between a 0.21 and 0.24 buy rate. Tommy Dreamer may need surgery on his back, which, if he were to get it, would require sitting out around 6 months. He is trying to avoid the surgery, but the retirement tease at this point is just an angle. The Weekend TV shot a lot of last-minute angles to set up the Taz vs. Tajiri and Lynn, and Van Dam vs. Storm and credible matches. They called Skull Von Crush as Vito the Skull Lo Grasso. They showed Devon Dudley attacking a plant fan, leading to Spike doing another balcony dive. Storm beat Lynn in a fast-paced, very good technical match. After a ref bump, they had everyone interfere to set up the pay-per-view match. They showed a clip of a During and Roadkill vs. Nova and Chetty match where Chetty did the Ricky Martin dancing to set up Nova getting pinned. Main was a three-way with Guido, Tajiri and Crazy, which ended up setting up the Taz vs. Tajiri angle where Taz was laid out. The three-way, which saw Sal E. Graziano interfere a lot, was about as good as you'll see for a three-way match. Except for one pay-per-view WCW match with Kidman, Juvie and Ray Heyman was trying to sign Tajiri and Crazy away from Victor Quiñones, who currently has them under contract as basically leases them to ECW for work in the US, since Quiñones is planning on starting a full-time territory in Puerto Rico, and wants to bring them in when the territory starts generating money. He is also trying to bring in Jinsei Shinzaki as a full-timer. WCW. As things appear right now, the August 14th Road Wild pay-per-view looks to be Hogan vs. Nash for the WCW title, Sting vs. Sid Vicious, Rodman and Medusa vs. Savage and Gorgeous George. This could still go in a lot of different ways, as TV seemed to build Savage vs. Rodman and Medusa vs. Miss Madness singles matches. But the plan, as we were told, was to do the mixed tag and let the women do most of the work. But if that were the case, it would make more sense to have Madness, who did the pull-apart angle with Medusa, involved in George. The original plan was for Rodman simply to ref Medusa vs. Madness. Goldberg vs. Rick Steiner, not a lock yet. The Triad vs. Harlem Heat for the tag titles. Bagwell vs. Miller, Conan vs. Vampiro, and some sort of a tag match involving Flair. One would think the buy rate should be way up for this show as compared with the previous three, although the past Sturgis pay-per-view shows have never done as well as expected. The plan is for Eric Bischoff to get the presidency of the company back and then go heel once again. As long as the booking is primarily for the egos of those doing the writing, the company is doomed to be playing catch-up. The plan was for Arn Anderson to return to the ring at the July 22nd Thunder in Moline, Illinois, although you know how WCW plans are. Although it's not official, it's pretty clear Nash's power is diminishing, and the people doing most of the TV writing and formatting are Bischoff, heavily influenced by Hogan, and Dusty Rhodes. Nitro on July 19th in Rockford, Illinois drew a sellout 7,558, 6,836 paying $195,923. They opened the show already hyping Sting vs. Flair and Hogan vs. Vicious. Vicious came out for an interview. Since they didn't have English subtitles, I don't know what he said. Finlay vs. Flynn was one of those sports entertainment matches. Jimmy Hart was on the video wall managing from there holding Finlay's hardcore trophy. Finally he goaded Finlay into going out of the building, where Knobs, Humorous Barbarian and Flynn all jumped him. The match just ended. Lenny Lane and Lodi did a segment with J.J. Dillon. They were afraid Dillon thought they were gay, but he thought they were brothers, and those lame announcers thought they were as well. The announcers should pretend to think they are, but let the audience know they know, because the announcers have to sell the product. Think about this logically. If you go to an auto dealership to buy a car and you recognize that the salesman is absolutely the most naive person on earth, you know, a guy who would see a 7-foot-tall guy in makeup and think it's Sting, would you buy the car from him? Someday someone in charge will understand this concept and realize that in 0.4 buy rate means that people aren't buying the cars off the lot anymore. It was funny with Dillon pretending to not hear whenever they asked for a raise. But since when did Dillon have any power? Aren't Flair, Piper and Charles Robinson the guys with that power, at least through the match later in the show? And where does Bischoff fit into all this, since he's at every press conference acting like he runs the company? Hogan did an interview and the crowd went wild for him. Actually, this crowd went wild for everything on the show, which is part of the reason it was a good show. Norman Smiley beat Lodi in 4:32 with a cool-looking cradle. Lodi held up a sign for Carolina Indie Omega Pro Wrestling. Lodi drank Heenan's drink at ringside, which they purported as being water. Smiley, Lodi and Lane all went to do the big wiggle, and every time the director switched the shots away from it. In WWF, they switch camera angles to show the slightest bit of nipple and best up-close shot of the blood streaming from a blade job, and in WCW, we can't watch Smiley dance. Sting beat Flair in 8:40 to win the company. They did a false finish where Sid interfered, leading to Flair putting on the figure 4, but Sting kicked out. It was mainly Flair and Anderson selling for Sting like he was God himself, and Sting no selling for Flair, all the while Bischoff blaming Flair for keeping Sting and the rest of the talent down the last 10 years. There's something in this picture that doesn't make any sense. Sting was dead 2 weeks ago, and after doing 2 weeks with Flair, he's over like a superstar. Next thing you know, they'll put Dusty out there for commentary and he'll complain about the referees getting bumped in every single match. This match had 3 ref bumps alone before Bischoff ran in and ruled Sting the winner, as Flair was in the Scorpion and Mickey J was down, having been bumped a second time. The reason there was so much hesitation in making the call and ringing the bell is that Flair was supposed to win due to Sid's help as late as 1 hour before the show started. They had changed the plan again during the week, but they changed it without telling anyone, so they all froze for a second when Bischoff signaled. Hudson played it pretty well, but the guy ringing the bell wouldn't ring it, figuring the Bischoff thing was a swerve. Crowd went nuts for the finish. Sid attacked Sting and powerbombed Bischoff until Hogan showed up and Sid took a powder. Rick Steiner beat Horace Hogan in 4:19 when Nash attacked Horace, leading to the Sky High Bulldog. Nash and Rick Steiner formed a new heel group. Hogan came out again and asked why Nash interfered when it was supposed to be business, and Nash told Hogan that I lied and it's very personal. Nash is wearing a ring shirt that reads Outsiders on it. Hall was originally to come back last week, but the new plan is for Nash after Road Wild to take a rest, and Nash and Hall will return together. This will probably all change again this week when the ratings come in. Eddie Guerrero beat Psychosis in 5:20 with Goria Special 2000, a combination neckbreaker and helicopter type move, and a frog splash. Guerrero looked really good here. After the match, Psychosis, Villano V and La Parka all attacked Guerrero, and Mysterio Jr. made the save. Mysterio Jr. did this awesome baseball slide into a tornado DDT on the floor on Parka. Guerrero and Mysterio Jr. squared off and then shook hands. Stevie Ray told Bryan Adams and Vince to watch his back in his next match. They agreed, which of course guaranteed they wouldn't. The Triad came out to do a comedy routine to lead to Stevie Ray versus Kanyon. Here's how the routine should have gone. Kanyon should have asked the question, who can carry Stevie Ray to a decent match? The crowd would have chanted, everybody. He'd prove by that one just how much the crowd doesn't get it. Anyway, if there is anyone who could, Kanyon is not that person, because this was bad, even though Kanyon was killing himself trying to be that person. DDP and Bigelow interfered after Ray delivered the slapjack. It appeared they were trying not to interfere before the 3 count, but they mistimed it and Patrick only counted 2 and called for the DQ, but it was announced as a pinfall because the save was too late, although clearly it wasn't. Kind of like Dean Malenko tapping out for no reason last week. The Triad was taping Ray to the ropes when Booker T made the save. Adams and Vince never showed up. The next segment was really weird. Robert Wool, who plays the character Arliss, showed up in his Arliss character and they called him Arliss rather than Robert Wool. That would be like that horrible angle when Lawler was selling for Bill Shatner, that instead of calling him Bill Shatner they'd call him Captain Kirk. He was acting like he was a famous sports agent, which is the role he plays. They are doing a wrestling segment on Arliss that was taped months ago but airs on July 25th, head-to-head with WWF Fully Loaded. Savage wrestled Kidman. This could have been really good, using Savage to elevate Kidman. Surely you jest at the mere thought that could have happened. Kidman got in a little offense, but he was mainly destroyed and left for dead with an elbow off the top. Savage wouldn't pin him, and gave him another elbow off the top. They could have put Chris Adams or Mike Enos or Dandy or any one of a million guys in this spot, but instead they choose to show that Kidman can't hang with the stars, and because of Savage's limitations, he can't even carry the old bums to a good match. Dennis Rodman ran in and hit Savage with a Persa 807. The least Savage could have done was let Kidman pin him after that, since Savage had already punched out ref Johnny Boone. Arliss hit the ring and acted like he was the promoter making Savage versus Rodman for Road Wild. Somewhere in there Medusa and Miss Madness went at it. Rodman never said a word. The crowd went wild for Rodman, but as mentioned, With the exception of Shane Douglas, who only about 10% of the crowd seemed to know, they went wild for everyone on this show. Conan beat Vampiro in 2:09 via DQ when, you guessed it, ICP ran in. Raven also returned and it appeared Raven, ICP, who at this point look to be regulars as they are scheduled for the next several shows, and Vampiro will form a grunge group. Mysterio Jr. tried to save, but the musicians destroyed him not with their guitars, but with leg drops and moonsault. Where was Eddie Guerrero? Bagwell came out in blackface with a fake Sonny Wanu. Eventually Miller came out and knocked out Bagwell with his red shoe. At least we didn't have to watch Miller wrestle. This was originally scheduled to be a match and not just the angle. Benoit and Saturn beat Hennigan Wyndham via DQ in 6:36 when, you guessed it, a whole bunch of guys ran in. It was becoming a pattern. The Cowboys ran in, Malenko tried to save but he didn't do much good, until Douglas showed up and cut a promo. Douglas did a good promo but most of the fans had no idea what he was talking about. He said there was a cancer in WCW and you all know who it is? I figure he meant Flair, but probably 90% of the TV audience didn't know what he was talking about and the announcers never brought it up. Maybe all the guys have spent too much time in the sun and there's a cancer epidemic, and that's what he was talking about. Finally Hogan beat Sid via DQ in 9:12 when, you guessed it, Nash interfered. Yeah, Hogan was on WCW Live last week, ready to have more influence, and he said how WCW needs more clean finishes and this is what we get. It's almost as funny as Bischoff blaming Flair for Benoit and Guerrero not getting a push. Crowd heat was great for the match, but the match was terrible. Sting made the save when Hogan was getting double-teamed, then Rick Steiner ran in, and finally Goldberg ran in, and the show ended with Hogan carrying the belt flanked by Sting and Goldberg triumphant in the ring. The not-too-subtle message is that the three big stars in the company are Hogan, Sting, and Goldberg, but the big star with the belt is still Hogan. Goldberg signed a renegotiated contract with a raise up to $1.5 million per year. WWF was salivating, and that may be too weak a term, hoping Goldberg would somehow extricate himself from WCW, although he had 3 years left on his contract, and they could promote Austin versus Goldberg. There were plans on the table and everything. It appears part of the reason WCW signed Rodman was as an out-of-court settlement to drop his lawsuit stemming from the bash at the beach last year where he only got $2.25 million and felt they deceived him in the contract negotiations of the other $550,000 due him. Hey, just because he showed up in no condition to perform doesn't mean they didn't deceive him in negotiations, or that they did. The presumption his deal for Road Wild is the same $1.5 million base plus a percentage of revenues above $3.9 million. Little does he know he's not making much on that percentage this time out. The truth of what Rodman means was revealed since there was little or no media buzz on his Nitro angle this time. Speaking of ridiculous figures, Kiss is receiving $500,000 to perform 2 songs on Nitro on August 23rd, plus Gene Simmons will introduce a new wrestler, the Kiss Demon, who will be played by Dale Torborg as a kid who grew up idolizing Gene Simmons. Remember that because someday it'll be next to Oz, the Ding Dongs, those dancing bears with Matt Bourne and Glacier in the WCW Gimmick Hall of Fame. They are also talking about a group of wrestlers as the Kiss Warriors, who will be made up as the other members of the band. WCW will get 4 TV Guide covers on August 15th, which will be Sting, Nash, Nitro Girls, and Savage. The 2 that would actually sell are Hogan and Goldberg. John Tenta was backstage on July 12th at Nitro looking for a job and looked to be less than 300 pounds. On WCW Live, Hogan said, among other things, that Pat Patterson made a pass at him on a road trip when he worked in the WWF. He went into more detail about why people supposedly went to Jesse's room when they wanted to party, marijuana references, said he thought Paul White was the guy he was going to pass the torch to, but that White didn't have the work ethic, and now he thinks it'll be Sting or Goldberg. Said the Master P thing was a flop and the only thing positive about it is it got Kurt Hennig over, and said even his kids and their friends knew Master P wasn't any good. He said there should be more clean finishes, no more mystery theater, bad vignettes, and they are dropping the Who Drove the Humvee angle at least for now. Said that Rodman has been doing a lot of partying and didn't have high hopes for him this time, but said he was okay the first time but not the second time. He said they have to get Flair and Piper back to being Flair and Piper and not the role they are in. On the July 15th Thunder show in the deal where Mike Tenay said Savage and Sid were there and would be coming out and later said they weren't, it had nothing to do with punishment but the illusion of such. It was all planned that way, to make people think Savage was being punished for throwing down Gorgeous George the previous Monday, but it was all planned ahead of time. WCW Worldwide starts soon on Channel 5 in the United Kingdom, which would be the strongest station to carry wrestling in many years in a strong 7 p.m. Friday night time slot. In Germany, they are advertising Bret Hart as the top star of the WCW Germany tour October 29th to October 31st. There were no house shows this past week. Wrestling with Shadows appears on A&E again on August 1st. They've talked with Disco Inferno about taking a bump on his head and doing an amnesia gimmick where he thinks he's one of the established stars like Hogan and Savage, and does promos mad at Benoit and Malenko for thinking they can take the main event spots from people like him and Hogan. Bret Hart had another reference in the Calgary Sun that went nowhere, saying something like there were 4 little pigs running around selling out their relatives to slaughter and then stopping himself with the story going nowhere. Hart was on The Fan in Toronto saying that Davey Boy Smith can wrestle where he wants, but that if he goes back to the WWF that he'd personally be disappointed. WWF. In what may prove to be next week's major story, TSN's Off the Record television show is going to Stamford, Connecticut on July 22nd to film 3 shows, the first with Vince McMahon, the second with Vince and Linda McMahon, and the third with Shane and Stephanie McMahon, with air dates scheduled for July 27th, July 28th, and August 3rd respectively at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. The first show is largely going to discuss McMahon's handling of the Owen Hart death, the Owen Hart Raw show, not stopping the pay-per-view show, writing the letter to the Calgary Sun about Martha Hart, why nobody from WWF went to Brian Pillman's funeral, Jesse Ventura and unionization of wrestlers, and criticism of the content of the Raw show. All the shows are expected to discuss and show a lot of clips of Hart. The Hockenberry Report on MSNBC was scheduled to do a major feature on pro wrestling last week, but the show was canceled literally days before it was to appear. Mick Foley is now not expected to return after double knee surgery until after Summerslam. The complete July 25th pay-per-view show looks to be Austin vs. Undertaker with the Stips in a First Blood WWF title match, Rock vs. Triple H in a strap match, X-Pac and Road Dogg vs. Gunn and China for the DX name show, the ever-expanding By the Week Man vs. Kane with Holly as ref, Shamrock vs. Blackman outside the building in a street fight type match with a circle of cars with their headlights on. When Shamrock was pro wrestling in the Carolinas for Nelson Royal's old South Atlantic Pro Wrestling about 10 years ago, he actually did fights like this for money. Hardy Boys and Hayes vs. Acolytes for the tag titles, Jarrett vs. Edge for the IC title, Snow vs. Bossman for the Hardcore title, and Midian vs. Brown for the European title. Some notes from the taped Raw that aired on July 19th. In the Shane/Stephanie skit, when Shane was talking about doing the right thing, I thought he was going to put somebody over clean for the European title. Instead, he called out Stephanie. Stephanie was backstage in this deserted part of the building with Test, who she calls Andrew but nobody else does. He begged her not to go out there, but she did. Boy, did he come off like a sappy wimp. Shane then told her to date Joey Obbs, who when he talked, must have been the only preppy boy in all of Greenwich growing up to sound like a farm boy from Virginia. She slapped Joey when he touched her hair, not Shane as we reported. Lawler arrived late on Monday for the Raw taping, I guess due to flight problems getting out of Memphis. It's amazing the editing they do, because that meant until he arrived that every camera shot that aired on Raw couldn't include an angle which would show Lawler sitting with Ross while we were hearing Kevin Kelly with Ross, and there were no glitches the entire period till Lawler got out there. It's actually amazing what they can do with technology these days to create illusions. With Goldust leaving, the GTV angle is going to have a different ending. GTV this week showed Ben Stiller plugging his movie Mystery Men, which Lawler and Ross also got a plug in for in the guise of an unsuspecting candid camera moment where he was talking about Deborah's puppies. Maybe they can be like WCW and it can just disappear like the driver of the Humvee. Maybe it's Jeff Farmer doing this as well. New mystery is who gave Jarrett the bloodbath, because it was neither Christian nor Edge. At the end of the show, just before Vince did the blade job, Austin threw him out of his wheelchair and he took a bump. One of the biggest news stories coming out of this past week's Television Critics Association press tour for the new season was UPN President Dean Valentine trying to defend themselves against critics for adding SmackDown to the fall schedule. Valentine rattled off all the practice phrases that WWF usually does. How the show is less violent than any Rocky movie. Said that wrestling doesn't cater to a low-level audience, saying what adults see of wrestling and what children think of it are entirely different. Luckily, all these people who talk this sanctimonious crap about the WWF being Sunday school entertainment compared to this or that don't socialize with anyone who teaches at public schools, or parents with 10-year-old daughters who have to hear little boys say certain things to them that they didn't pick up on Springer or daytime soaps or in movies. Valentine also said he didn't think there was anything violent or sexist about the WWF. He admitted there is occasional blood, but no guns ever go off and nobody ever gets knifed on WWF shows. UPN has assigned members of its broadcast standards team to review the SmackDown shows, which will be taped on Tuesday for a Thursday air date. When Valentine was asked about pimps and prostitutes after saying there's nothing sexist on WWF, his response was, "I'm not exactly sure why that's sexist," and then noted how they have similar characters on other television shows and said it's all a comedy. WWF hasn't toned down some of the character values as sexist, but they have greatly toned down some of the sexual aspects of the show, limited largely to Deborah as the tease and the hoe train, and increased the emphasis on the blood in its place. The Hollywood Reporter said it couldn't have been worse for Valentine if he had a bullseye attached to his forehead. SmackDown debuts on August 26th. The September 30th episode will be 90 minutes, followed by a 30-minute debut of a new show called Shasta McNasty, which will have WWF performers on the show. WWF closed a deal on July 14 to create a $25 million themed restaurant with more than 600 seats at the corner of Broadway and 43rd Street in Manhattan in Times Square. In addition to a restaurant, the complex will include a retail store, an interactive arcade, and a theater. There has been some talk of Jericho working with X-Pac early on in his tenure, although many different ideas for debuting Jericho have been batted around. Animal is undergoing back surgery. The LOD has already been given word that they will be released when their contracts expire in the spring. Mark Henry is taking a lot of heat because he weighed in at more than 400 pounds and they want him preferably around 340, but I've told him they want him down to 350. They look to be splitting Henry and Brown up and giving Brown a singles push. They want Brown down to 250. He was about 7 pounds above that at the weigh-in. I'd hate to think what the Big Show has been weighing these days. They also want Mideon down in weight and have asked him to study tapes of Jake Roberts to play that type of psychological character. Nicole Bass, Shannon Hall, Goldust and Ryan Shamrock are all gone. Bass was officially given notice. I believe she had just signed a contract but was claiming that she could earn $15,000 to $20,000 per month doing so-called apartment wrestling, which is this fetish thing. Someone actually sent me her promo literature and it sort of makes your skin creep, for guys who want to get overpowered by a woman. She wasn't making anywhere close to that in the WWF, and it didn't look like she'd be making it anytime soon. There was unhappiness over her failure to improve in the ring. There was also the problem that as long as she was around, fans would want to see her wrestle Chyna, and the problem with that match is management felt it would kill the illusion of Chyna. They don't want Chyna selling for any women, not to mention the match would be so awful they'd figure Chyna would get damaged. Her being there kind of worked against Chyna's original gimmick, but with the new face, giant implants and makeup, Chyna's gimmick is different anyway. Hall, former fitness contestant, cheerleader, boxer and American Gladiator, was recruited when WWF was talking about doing an all-women's television show, and when WWF was looking to expand an in-ring women's division. Goldust has been out with a bad back. There are a number of reasons here, among them he and Terry Runnels are about to be divorced, and apparently with her signing a new deal, they felt she was the more marketable of the two. As a side note, bookers have incredible real-life power, as over the past few years we've seen 4 married couples have booked breakups: the Sullivans, the McMichaels, the Maros and the Runnels, and except the Maros, all followed with almost identical breakups. After the McMichaels breakup, people joked that Kevin Sullivan, who booked both WCW angles, was the expert at booking marriages to end, including his own, particularly since the angle in his with Benoit wound up with his wife legitimately winding up with Benoit. We were told, and I don't know how serious this was, but it was said to me as him being very serious. I guess it could have been his way of getting a release to go to WCW, where he's expected to wind up now that his father has some power, that he suggested to McMahon that he wanted an operation to have implants put in his chest and even have the operation filmed for television so he could take the Goldust character to a new level. Obviously he'd heard about the Thai male kickboxer Perinya undergoing a sex change and all the pub it's gotten all over the world. McMahon wasn't willing to go that far, and Runnels felt that they weren't giving him a chance to reach his potential, and that led to the exit. Ryan Shamrock wouldn't sign the contract they offered as she, the age of 20, didn't want her to make as long a term commitment as they wanted her to, so both sides have gone their separate ways. E.T. interviewed Chyna and Triple H for a piece that was to air this week. The August 23rd Raw in Iowa City, Iowa sold out in 6 hours. Jim Garvin was actually backstage at a Raw show in Charlotte, not the pay-per-view in Greensboro, a few weeks back. His actual weight was said to be 245, but I'm told if you saw him he definitely looked more than 250. Also backstage at the show in Charlotte were Wahoo McDaniel, Sweet Hansen, Renee Goulet, Bobby Eaton, and Don Coronado. Shows this past week saw the Raw taping on July 13th in Lexington, Kentucky draw 12,939, paying $312,384, A house show July 16th in San Jose drew 14,619 paying $363,305. July 17th in Anaheim, California drew a sellout of 14,769 paying $415,346 and July 18th in Bakersfield, California drew 7,109 paying $179,500. At the house shows, Austin over Triple H via DQ was the main event along with Show over Undertaker via DQ and Rock over Bossman in the night stick match as the top draws. Merchandise for the week was $339,488 or $6.87 per head. The readers' pages. Chris Jericho. It's not very often that I truly get excited about something that happens in wrestling. June 30, 1999 was the exception. The guy that I had been hoping would sign with WWF for months and finally bring wrestling back to the WWF finally did so, and to this day I'm in great anticipation of his arrival. Chris Jericho is without a doubt one of the most talented wrestlers in not only North America, but also the world. Like you said, the guy has it all, in ring savvy, charisma, mic skills, etc. I feel he has the opportunity to reach new heights with Titan. But I worry that after a few months of working WWF style, that his work rate will drop. As long as they don't put him with the big stiffs they have on the roster, and match him up with other talented guys his size like Edge and Christian, and maybe in time Triple H and Rock, he definitely could be the next Shawn Michaels. Time will tell how far he will get. But if based on talent alone, the guy is a lock to main event WrestleMania before he's through. Rock did it, and how long has he been wrestling? Marcel Molina. Alhambra, California. I had a right to express my profound relief over Chris Jericho signing with the WWF. Like many of your readers, I've watched in dismay while WCW buried its greatest future asset as one of several mind-numbing decisions that have led to their recent demise. How this promotion can be such a failure despite having the greatest talent pool and financial backing in the history of the industry speaks volumes about the political machinations going on. The thought of Jericho signing with WCW and being wasted for another 3 years, or more, was downright scary. Barring any piss-poor booking, the WWF will undoubtedly polish Jericho into a major player for the new millennium. How ironic that a decade ago we were all bemoaning Titan for not pushing future superstars like Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels. Now, out of necessity, they've become a leader in developing young talent. Finally, after several months of taking more pleasure in reading The Observer than actually watching wrestling, I'm greatly looking forward to watching Jericho claim his rightful place as one of the great all-around stars in the business. Bruce Colon. Chicago, Illinois. WCW has done it again. It wasn't enough that they let Steve Austin and Brian Pillman get away. Now it's Chris Jericho. Jericho's performances have always been a delight, and it's amazing WCW couldn't see his potential. If the WWF handles him correctly, I expect him to be the biggest wrestling star since Austin. Many years ago, The Observer published a poem written by Jericho concerning the death of Art Barr. After reading the poem without ever having seen him perform, I felt Jericho had to be a special performer. The possibility now exists for outstanding verbal duels with Jericho and the likes of Austin, Mick Foley, and Rock. In view of Eric Bischoff's insistence on shoving aging wrestlers down everyone's throats, while flatly refusing to push the young wrestlers, WCW may as well rename itself Senior Citizen Wrestling. Billy Kidman's brilliance in the ring, Eddie Guerrero's great talents as both a wrestler and a heel, Bill Goldberg's charisma and Rey Mysterio Jr.'s unparalleled acrobatic grace stand no more chance of being valued than did Jericho's attributes. Jan Wood. Mobile, Alabama. Damn it, it's not a cross. In recent months, the WWF has claimed that they aren't doing any satanic angles. Then please explain the Undertaker 666 t-shirt in the latest Raw magazine? Mark Underwood. Yuba City, California. Response from Dave Meltzer, it's a symbol. It's not a cross. When Undertaker said on Raw hook him up to the cross, it was edited out on Livewire that nobody watches, so therefore, he really never said it. The WWF doesn't do any satanic worship. They don't have characters who play prostitutes. They're hoes, damn it. They don't have pimps. He's just a fun-loving guy who happens to say pimpin' ain't easy. That stuff with women falling out of their tops. It's child's play compared to 90,210, I'll bet that everyone who repeats that line has never actually seen an episode of 90,210. They don't do castration. It was something John Belushi did on Saturday Night Live. Besides, those Saturday morning shows that kids watch are edited. They don't want kids watching Raw. Besides, it's fake. Get it? Fake. So it's unfair that they all pick on wrestling. Remember Len Bias, and Len Bias. And what was that other guy's name on the Celtics? And all those athletes in the Olympics use drugs, too. You're asking why they don't have people drop dead so fast. Well, that's against the agreements of an interview. You can't ask about Brian Pillman and you can't ask about deaths or you can't get an interview. Besides, it's all fake. You're not supposed to be asking real questions about something fake. Besides, everyone's just jealous because they kick the NFL's butt every Monday night. At least among kids under 12. But, remember, they don't want those kids to watch. But if their parents think it's okay, who has the right to get in the way of decision-making of parents? And besides, Sting did the same thing 100 times. Don't you know all the made-up statistics? As far as your question, and any similar question, and any other question we have no earthly idea how to answer, you just don't get it. I'm confused and you're responsible, and I demand an explanation. In a recent Observer you wrote, and I'm quoting you directly, Mr. Ass beat meat. Here's the problem. Does that mean a wrestler beat an opposing wrestler? Or that he performed some new sports entertainment act in the middle of the ring? A respected journalist such as yourself should be more specific. Mark Brown. Response from Dave Meltzer, it means, depending on your personal sense of humor, that either the writers of the show are clever, or have something of a perverted sense of humor. WCW. WCW is without a doubt the worst promotion in the history of pro wrestling. I know longtime fans have images of California Championship Wrestling, NWA Central States and Continental which conjure up horrible memories. The fact is, these promotions ran on shoestring budgets and had essentially very little talent. For the amount of money WCW is backed with, and the amount of brains that work in the creative process, it is simply a joke. Anyone with half a brain just needs to watch Nitro for 30 minutes to see most of WCW's flaws. The saddest part of the whole situation is the fans are being robbed of the best single talent roster in wrestling history. I'm so damn tired of guys like Kevin Nash and Diamond Dallas Page having enough time on their schedule to knock fans on the internet. All these two guys do is make excuses about why WCW is getting its ass kicked by WWF. These guys or others like them repeatedly talk about the fans as being marks and how the fans don't understand the politics, and basically whine about them being Tuesday morning bookers. For God's sake, who are those two trying to bullshit? Nitro is awful. It's devoid of any continuity or logic. Little kids come up to me and ask, where is Tank Abbott? Where's the Wolfpack? How can DDP, Canyon and Bam Bam defend the tag titles as a three-man team? I have no answers for any of those questions. I tell them to watch my old tapes of Mid-South Wrestling to watch booking continuity and top-flight action. What is that old saying? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. How about being fooled a million times? What is Dusty Rhodes doing being anywhere near a booking meeting? He fooled the hierarchy in WCW into thinking he can book again. It just boggles the mind that the guy who ran a thriving NWA into the ground in the late 80s and failed as a booker everywhere else after that keeps getting new opportunities. It just proves that WCW will never change. Don't give me the bullshit that they need a new booker. The success of WCW from 1995 to 1997 was just an aberration. WCW will never reach those heights again the way they are structured. The real WCW is a promotion whose booker makes himself world champion even though he has only 6 moves. The real WCW has people like Diamond Dallas Page who think that Chris Jericho wasn't a major loss, even though Jericho will eventually be headlining a WWF pay-per-view show that will triple the buys of a WCW pay-per-view. The real WCW is the one, like Conan said, that gives pushes to losers whose only credits are being buddies with those with influence. Will Van Hammer, the Cat and NWO Black and White draw anything except channel-switching viewers? With Nash, DDP, Rhodes and Bischoff in charge, the Denver Broncos would be an 0-16 team. They'd probably think Terrell Davis should be benched in favor of starting Dusty Rhodes because of all his experience. WCW thinks bringing Hogan back will make the difference. The WWF, even in its near-bankrupt phase in 1996 and 1997, have always had smooth storylines and very watchable television. WWF politics never seem to deter from the product itself. That's why for the most part over the past 20 years the WWF has had more profitable years than losing years. WCW is different. They've always been mired in ridiculous politics which have tainted the company since the late 80s. It's not only politics, it's basic ineptness as well. WCW's new advertising campaign sums it up. It's out there. In WCW's case, they are out there with Herb Abrams' UWF. With as much money as WCW is backed with, Politics aside, WCW should be the smoothest running organization in wrestling. The Ric Flair Thunder fiasco and Bill Goldberg having to be in two places at the same time are signs of terrible management. Aside from the aberration with the NWO gimmick, WCW has not changed from the politicking, sometimes unwatchable promotion born when Jim Crockett sold the territory. Hopefully some suits and ties in the Time Warner organization will at least realize what's going on and put some sort of pressure down on the WCW clowns. I forgot that I'm a mark. I don't understand the politics. All I know is millions of other viewers seem to agree with my opinion every Tuesday afternoon when Nielsen spits out the ratings. It's not a temporary thing. WCW won't change without a massive overhaul. Bischoff and Hogan said how a guy like Sean Waltman can't cut the mustard. All he became was the best worker in the WWF, gets big pops every night, makes a WWF television show worth watching and hasn't been out for any length of time with an injury. What a bum he turned out to be. Jason Singh. Vallejo, California. The success of WCW was a fluke. There can be no other explanation. Business turned for WCW with a decent TV show and key signings from the WWF. When Lex Luger walked onto Nitro, it was electric. Scott Hall and Kevin Nash showed up and it was great. The WWF's creative freefall helped the popularity of WCW. We got to see either the fake Razor Ramon and Diesel angles and people like the DOA and Nation and other groups that never got over being pushed. It was as bad then as Nitro is now, only the WWF made changes. The problem with WCW, among the many you write about every week, is not just they've ruined their young talent. First, they piss away the popularity of Bill Goldberg. He's their biggest mainstream star and everyone sets him up to fail. But the big problem is they never follow up anything they start. When they were at their popularity peak more than a year ago, instead of using their popularity to create new stars, we got Dennis Rodman and Karl Malone. Self-serving angles and matches that led nowhere. They made money, but so what? Everything made money at that point. They followed with Jay Leno. They might have been good for the pub, but it was self-serving nonetheless, and totally unwatchable television. The Flock was a decent way to introduce the audience to new wrestlers, except none of them became stars and WCW never did anything with any of them. Then came the Ultimate Warrior fiasco. They killed the return of Ric Flair shortly after a fluke great TV moment. Combine this with NWO angles that went nowhere, and here we are in 1999 and WCW sucks and their popularity is plummeting at a time when the popularity of wrestling is still very strong. No scandal. No industry downturn. Just poor management. Could you ever see Vince McMahon killing cities like Hogan killed all the cities in the Carolinas simply to stick to it? The Flair fans? What other promotion would purposely kill its fan base to satisfy the ego of one person? It boggles the mind. How long ago were we watching a group of NWO guys in hoods beat up Flair in a field? 2 weeks later, he's shaking his hand as president of the company and going heel. Why try and be a soap opera? Be a wrestling TV show? Yes, they need to get Benoit, Malenko, Raven, Kidman and others over, but there can be a transition period that lasts several years if done correctly. They have the star power and the talent at this point. The problem is Nash as Booker is trying to copy the WWF when it's clear they don't have the organization or the creativity to do so. They've killed their world title with bogus stips and screw jobs. We've seen a million angles started that never led to matches. Hogan versus Nash. Hogan versus Hart. If they put together a round-robin series of matches with Hogan, Luger, Sting, Hart, DDP, Flair, Nash, and Goldberg, fans would watch. But besides Flair, who would do the jobs? It created a work environment where everyone is out for themselves and the company suffers. Having said all that, I still think WCW is only 6 months away from a turnaround if they start to do things right. But that's a big if. It wasn't that long ago that Nitro was hosted by Mongo with that little dog. Then they got hot. Things changed and the momentum is clearly with the WWF. Losing Jericho was another sign that the leadership needs to wake up. They need to do the opposite of what WCW would do. They have the star power, or at least they did, before they killed everyone. They can make it was a straightforward format. Now quite all Japan, but similar concepts. There's an audience that only watches Raw because who can sit through 3 hours of Nitro. It's painful. You could still have angles, but at least have matches that mean something with winners and losers. Instead of trying a more radical approach, Bischoff wastes money on Sid Vicious. Dennis Rodman then signs people like Tank Abbott and Master P at $200,000 a shot, and signs one of Master P's flunkies for $400,000 a year. And they can't offer enough money to sign Jericho. He wants Yokozuna. Why not King Kong Bundy? He had appeal years ago and is available. Bischoff was straight enough to admit they fell asleep at the wheel, but is he honest enough to admit that changes need to be made? Yes, the WWF changed what the audiences now wants, because when the WWF was getting hot, Bischoff was lounging on the Tonight Show set feeding his ego and letting the company fall apart. The Nitro crowd at the Georgia Dome and the one the WWF will draw makes the point clear. Changes need to be made. Stop signing wrestlers nobody cares about. Stop giving creative control to wrestlers. Push the young guys and fade out the old guys. Putting the belt on Hogan at this point makes no sense. It should be on Hart, and make Goldberg the top challenger for it. Put together programs like Sting vs. Goldberg, Luger vs. Goldberg, Hogan vs. Hart, and Nash vs. Hart, which are matches people would pay to see, if they knew they were getting clean finishes. WCW could be the opposite of the WWF, instead of just claiming to be, and people would tune in. Is this really that radical? Imagine all the time saved trying to come up with the same run-in finish that could be spent on ways of putting together a clean finish and a storyline that benefits both guys. Also, seeing the demos, and the fact WCW is a TV company, they don't know who their audience is. Why not make the announcers react smart? It's something different. Is this really so radical? Instead of making any of these changes, we'll get more Hogan, more Savage, and more Ernest Miller. Of course, most WCW personnel are watching Raw while they are filming Nitro, so what can we really expect? If they don't care enough to watch their own show, why should we? Paul Nucci, East Point, Michigan. Response from Dave Meltzer: I don't think it was just Hogan who stuck it to the Carolinas and killed the region. There was more than one person in that company that hated aspects of wrestling history, in particular that people who they wanted to believe meant nothing in wrestling were really cultural icons, and had their reasons for wanting to kill their legacy. It wasn't anyone trying to kill the Carolinas that was the idea. The idea was to kill Flair and stick it to him, in particular in the markets that he meant the most, to try and portray the old era was over and not as good as the real stars. This is a typical mindset of wrestling. If you recall, in 1987, when Jim Crockett bought Bill Watts, Booker Dusty Rhodes, instead of going with an interpromotional idea that would have been huge business, attempted to kill off the UWF to prove that the NWA was really the best all along, since before the buyout there was something of a promotional rivalry. The Hogan-Flair program in WWF never came close to its potential because McMahon wouldn't allow Flair's legacy to be part of the program because it was a legacy he warred against. The New Japan vs. UWFI program was huge for a short period of time because Riki Choshu killed it off almost from the start to show New Japan's superiority. The NWO angle in WCW had more legs than any of the above because the home team lost the political power to the visitors, so to speak, when Hogan and Bischoff, the main home team power brokers, joined the visitors in the angles and let their egos book. But the long-term problem with that one is they did a reverse, and the egos then wanted to kill the home team legacy rather than do an even program, which could have been huge business for even longer. We warned them over and over by attempting to ruin Flair in the markets where he was the big draw. It wouldn't result in the new power base getting over in the Carolinas, but would kill the Carolinas, one of their key drawing markets, but with business overall on the upswing, that they didn't care about regions and thought they could do no wrong, and didn't understand the first thing about the long-term effects of what they were doing. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine,